Before we begin, a quick thank you to Jack's Jams for suggesting this topic in the comments. We read every single one of them, and this one immediately went to the top of the list. If you're listening on Spotify and you haven't left us a review yet, it takes literally 10 seconds and it genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Now, let's talk about a man most people have never heard of. A man who spent decades buried inside the most classified corners of the American military. A man whose career quietly intersected with some of the most sensitive programs ever funded by the United States government. And a man who, after his retirement, became the quiet centre of one of the most compelling conspiracy theories in modern UFO research. This is the story of General Neil McCasland and what he may, or may not, have known. The making of a general. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside the upper levels of the United States Air Force. It is not the silence of empty rooms or abandoned buildings. It is the silence of people who have been trained for decades to say absolutely nothing, to give nothing away, to exist at the highest clearance levels of the most powerful military on Earth, and to carry that weight without ever letting it show on their face. Neil McCasland was one of those people. His career began the way most military careers do, quietly, methodically, one rank at a time. He entered the Air Force with the kind of technical aptitude that the military identifies early and cultivates carefully. The early years of his service placed him in the world of weapons development, a domain so compartmentalised that even the people working within it often don't fully understand what the person 3 officers down is building. It is a world of need to know, a world where the right hand genuinely does not know what the left hand is doing, not because of negligence or incompetence, but because the architecture of the system is specifically designed that way. By the early 2000s, McCasland had accumulated enough experience, enough trust, and enough clearance to be placed in roles that most officers never see in an entire career. He was operating at the intersection of advanced weapon systems, nuclear oversight, and classified research programs. These were not desk jobs. These were not administrative postings. These were operational positions at the leading edge of what the United States government was willing to fund, build, and keep hidden from the public. Think about what that actually means for a moment. When we talk about classified research programs in the context of the US military, we are not talking about minor bureaucratic secrets. Think about what that actually means for a moment. When we talk about classified research programs in the context of the US military, we are not talking about minor bureaucratic secrets. We are talking about technologies and capabilities that the American public may not learn about for decades, if ever. Some of the programs running through Air Force research and development in the early 2000s would not be acknowledged for another 15 or 20 years. Some have still never been acknowledged at all. McCasland was inside that world, not on the periphery, inside it. He moved through his career with the kind of quiet efficiency that gets a person promoted without attracting attention. No major public controversies, no congressional hearings with his name attached, no leaked documents bearing his signature, just a steady, methodical climb through the ranks, each new role granting him access to programs that most of his colleagues would never know existed. It is, on the surface, the story of a dedicated and competent military officer who served his country faithfully and then retired. That is the official version. That is the version that exists in public records and press releases. But underneath that version, buried in the footnotes of defence procurement filings and the quiet corners of UFO research forums, is a different story. A story about where exactly McCasland served, what exactly he oversaw, and what, if anything, he may have encountered along the way. AST 2, 02, Wright-Patterson and the Weight of Location. If you have spent any time reading about the history of UFO investigations in the United States, you have encountered Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It is impossible to discuss this subject seriously without eventually arriving there. Located near Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson has been one of the most important military installations in the country for nearly a century. Its history stretches back to the earliest days of American aviation. The Wright brothers themselves did some of their foundational work near this location. The base grew into a sprawling complex of research facilities, testing grounds and classified laboratories that, over the decades, became associated with some of the most sensitive programs in the US defense establishment. For the UFO research community, Wright-Patterson carries a specific and loaded significance. This is the base where, according to decades of testimony, rumour and second-hand accounts, materials recovered from anomalous aerial incidents were allegedly transported for analysis. The most famous of those incidents, the one that has anchored UFO mythology for more than 70 years, is Roswell. The year was 1947. Something came down in the New Mexico desert. The Army Air Forces initially announced the recovery of a flying disc. Within 24 hours, that announcement was walked back, replaced by a far more mundane explanation involving a weather balloon. But the original announcement had already been made, the word had already gotten out, and the questions that followed have never fully gone away. According to the historical record, materials from the Roswell site were transported to what was then Wright Field in Ohio. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented fact, referenced in official military communications from the period. Decades later, when Neil McCasland's career trajectory is examined through the lens of this history, something interesting emerges. His roles within Air Force research and development placed him in direct proximity to the acquisition pipelines and research channels that flow through Wright-Patterson. Not necessarily inside the most classified vaults of the facility, not necessarily in direct contact with any specific anomalous materials, but close enough that anyone building a theory about institutional knowledge of unusual technologies would have to include his name on the list of people who, at minimum, had access to the infrastructure through which such knowledge would have travelled. This is a crucial distinction, and it is one that serious UFO researchers try very hard to maintain. The difference between someone who was in a position where they could have encountered extraordinary information and someone who definitively did encounter such information is enormous. One is a structural observation about career placement. The other is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. McCasland's connection to Wright-Patterson is, at this stage of the story, firmly in the first category. He was positioned in the right place. Whether anything flowed through that position that went beyond conventional classified research is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. But the location matters. In the world of intelligence and military research, physical proximity to sensitive infrastructure creates pathways for knowledge. Compartmentalization is real. Information is deliberately fragmented so that no single person holds the full picture. But the people managing those compartments, the people overseeing the flow of resources and personnel and funding across multiple programs, develop a different kind of awareness. They may not know what is inside each container, but they know that certain containers exist. They know that certain programs receive funding that is never publicly explained. They know that certain questions, asked in certain rooms, are met with a silence that communicates more than any answer ever could. Neil McCasland spent years in exactly those rooms. ACE 2, 03, the research years and the programs that left no footprints. Between 2005 and 2011, McCasland's career entered a phase that would later become the focal point of conspiracy theorist attention. During this period, he held high-level roles connected to Air Force research and development, positions that placed him at the operational intersection of experimental technologies, long-term defense projects, and what the research community obliquely refers to as black budget programs. Black budget. The term sounds dramatic, almost cinematic, but it refers to something very real and very specific in the context of American defense spending. The United States government allocates billions of dollars each year to programs that are not publicly disclosed. The existence of these programs is sometimes acknowledged in broad strokes, a classified line item in the defense budget, a vague reference in an oversight committee report. But the specific nature of the work, the technologies being developed, the results being achieved, all of that remains invisible to the public and in many cases to most of Congress itself. The people who run these programs operate in a space where normal accountability structures simply do not apply. They answer to a very small number of people. They file reports that are never released. They build things that are never shown. McCasland's involvement in Air Force research and development during this period placed him in supervisory or oversight roles that touched these programs. Again, the precise nature of his involvement cannot be fully established from publicly available information. What can be established is the structural reality of his position. He held the kind of role that, by definition, would have given him visibility into programs that the public knows nothing about. In 2017, the New York Times published an investigation revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a previously classified Pentagon effort to study unidentified aerial phenomena. In 2017, the New York Times published an investigation revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP, a previously classified Pentagon effort to study unidentified aerial phenomena. The program had been funded secretly for years. It had produced reports that described encounters between military pilots and craft that moved in ways that violated known physics. It had investigated materials that were claimed to have anomalous properties. Its existence was not a rumour or a conspiracy theory. It was confirmed in the pages of one of the most credible newspapers in the world by people who had worked on it. The revelation of ATIP opened a door that had been firmly shut for decades, and it forced a reckoning with a simple but uncomfortable question. If this program existed without public knowledge, what else existed? What else had been funded, studied, and quietly buried in the classified archives of the American military? The answer, by definition, is unknowable from the outside, but the question itself reframes everything, including the careers of people like Neil McCasland, who spent years inside exactly the kind of institutional structures where such programs would have lived. AIXT 304, Richard Dolan and the Roswell Thread. The man who first drew significant public attention to McCasland's name in the context of UFO research was Richard Dolan, one of the most respected and rigorously sourced researchers in the field. Dolan has spent decades examining the intersection of military history, intelligence operations, and unexplained aerial phenomena. He approaches the subject with a historian's discipline, distinguishing carefully between documented facts, credible testimony, and speculation. He is not a person who attaches famous names to conspiracy theories carelessly. When Dolan began discussing McCasland in public forums and research presentations, the argument he made was structural rather than sensational. He was not claiming that McCasland had personally handled alien technology, or that he had been briefed on extraterrestrial contact. The argument was more subtle and in some ways more unsettling precisely because of its subtlety. The core of Dolan's analysis rested on a simple chain of institutional logic. If materials from the Roswell incident were real, if something was recovered that the government has never publicly explained, those materials would not have simply sat in a warehouse. They would have been studied, analysed, incorporated to whatever extent was possible into the research and development infrastructure of the military. And that infrastructure, over the decades that followed 1947, evolved and changed and reorganised itself. Programs moved between agencies. Oversight shifted between offices. The people responsible for managing the most sensitive research moved in and out of positions as their careers progressed. McCasland's career trajectory placed him squarely within the institutional lineage of exactly the kind of oversight role that would have carried forward the management of any such program. Not as the originator, but possibly as someone who inherited custodial responsibilities for work that began long before he arrived. This is the custodian hypothesis, the idea that certain individuals within the military research establishment serve not as innovators or investigators, but as managers of a secret that predates them. They did not create the situation, they did not make the original discovery, but they were placed, by the architecture of their careers, in a position where the maintenance of that secret became part of their responsibilities. Where not asking certain questions and not speaking about certain things was simply part of the job description, as implicit and as mandatory as any other duty. The Roswell connection in this framework is not about McCasland personally touching debris from a crash site or walking through a facility where bodies were stored. It is about institutional inheritance. It is about the possibility that the programs born from whatever happened in the New Mexico desert in 1947 never truly ended. that they evolved and migrated through the defence research establishment over the following 7 decades, and that Neil McCasland, through the specific arc of his career, became one of the people responsible for their continuation. Whether that is true cannot be established from outside the classification wall, but the argument is not absurd. The argument is structurally coherent, and that coherence is what has kept McCasland's name in circulation within serious UFO research circles long after most conspiracy theories about specific military figures have faded into internet noise. ASEAT 405. The architecture of secrecy, how compartmentalization works. To understand why the McCasland theory persists, and why it remains genuinely impossible to definitively debunk, you need to understand how classified information actually works inside the American military and intelligence establishment. Because the popular image of classification, the idea of a vault somewhere that contains the truth, and that the right person with the right key could simply open, is almost entirely wrong. The reality is far stranger, and far more difficult to penetrate. Compartmentalization is the foundational principle of how the most sensitive information in the US government is managed. The concept is exactly what it sounds like. Information is divided into compartments, and access to each compartment is restricted independently of every other compartment. A person can have the highest available security clearance and still be completely ignorant of programs running 2 floors below them in the same building, because those programs exist in separate compartments to which that person has not been specifically granted access. The access determination is not based on rank or clearance level alone. It is based on need to know, a formal determination that a specific individual requires access to a specific piece of information in order to perform a specific function. Need to know is assessed independently for every compartment. A 4-star general may have access to programs that a colonel does not, but that same general may be entirely excluded from programs that a specific lieutenant colonel is managing because the general has no operational need to know what is in that compartment. There are programs that operate with such deep classification that even the president is not fully briefed on their details. The result of this system is a kind of institutional fragmentation that is almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. Information exists, real, documented, actively maintained information, but it is distributed across so many separate compartments, managed by so many different people with so many different specific access authorizations, that no single person ever holds the full picture. The people at the very top of the system, the Secretary of Defense, the President, have broad access but not complete access. There are programs, according to multiple credible accounts over the decades, that operate with such deep classification that even the President is not fully briefed on their details. This is not hyperbole. This is the documented architecture of American intelligence management, confirmed by people who have worked within it, and it creates a profound epistemological problem for anyone trying to understand what any given individual within the system actually knew. Because the answer to that question depends not just on the person's rank or role, but on the specific, often invisible, compartment access authorizations that define the precise boundaries of their knowledge. When the custodian hypothesis talks about McCasland as someone positioned between classified discoveries, government leadership and private defense contractors, it is describing exactly this kind of systemic visibility. Not the person who makes the discovery, not the political leadership that decides what to do with it, but the institutional layer in between, the people who know that the discovery happened, who manage the flow of resources toward its continued study, and who ensure that the information stays inside the system. Act 406. The quiet forums and the pattern that emerged. The way McCasland's name entered UFO research circles is itself instructive about how serious research in this field actually operates. It was not a dramatic revelation, not a leaked document or a whistleblower stepping forward with specific claims. It was something more methodical, and in its own way, more compelling. A pattern that emerged from independent researchers examining different threads of evidence and arriving independently at the same institutional intersection. In online forums dedicated to serious UFO research, places where the conversation skews toward procurement records and congressional testimony rather than alien abduction narratives. McCasland's name began appearing in discussions about classified aerospace programs sometime in the mid-2010s. The references were, as they often are in this kind of research, indirect at first, a researcher examining the career paths of Air Force personnel who had served in specific research oversight roles would note McCasland's name in a list of relevant figures. Another researcher, approaching the same territory from a different angle, perhaps tracing the institutional history of specific programs at Wright-Patterson, would arrive at the same name through a completely different route. This kind of independent convergence is actually more significant, from a research methodology standpoint, than a single dramatic claim. When multiple researchers, using different sources and different analytical approaches, arrive at the same person without coordinating their investigations, it suggests that the person's career genuinely sits at a meaningful intersection of the research landscape. The references in these forums were consistently careful to distinguish between structural observation and specific claims. No serious researcher was asserting that McCasland had confirmed alien contact or that he possessed the specific classified knowledge of extraterrestrial programs. The assertions were more carefully bounded, that his career path was significant, that his institutional positions were relevant, that his name appeared in contexts that warranted further research. The language was cautious, the analytical framework was structural. This is the epistemological landscape of serious UFO research at its best, a careful accumulation of structural observations, each one individually inconclusive, but collectively pointing toward a pattern that is difficult to explain through simple coincidence. The pattern that emerges around McCasland is not one person making one dramatic claim. It is multiple researchers approaching the same institutional landscape from different directions, finding the same name at the same intersections. Act 5, 07-2014, The Retirement and the Timing. Question. In 2014, Neil McCasland retired from the United States Air Force. By every publicly available account, the retirement was entirely conventional. There was no controversy attached to it, no congressional investigation bearing his name, no public statement that raised eyebrows. He completed his service and stepped out of the institutional structure that had defined his career for decades. In the world of the conspiracy theory, however, the timing of his retirement became a data point, not a definitive one, not an explosive revelation, but a data point that theorists found difficult to set aside entirely. 2014 falls within a period of significant and growing public pressure on the US government regarding UFO-related information. The years surrounding that retirement saw an increasing drumbeat of congressional interest in UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, the government's preferred terminology for what the public continues to call UFOs. Former officials were beginning to speak more openly about the existence of programs that had studied these phenomena. Pilots were filing more formal reports of encounters. The infrastructure of the modern UAP disclosure movement was beginning to assemble itself, even if the most dramatic public moments were still several years away. But the theory suggests something more complicated, that the most sensitive knowledge does not exist solely in official files and properly maintained classified archives, that it also exists in the memories and experiential understanding of the people who managed it, and that when those people leave the system, one by one over the course of decades, something is lost, not necessarily deliberately suppressed, not necessarily destroyed, but lost to the accumulation of individual retirements and the natural erosion of institutional memory. McCasland's retirement in this framework is not a suspicious event. It is a structural marker, the moment when one more thread of direct institutional continuity with whatever those classified programs contained was quietly severed. Est 508. The disappeared narrative and what the internet built. In the wilder corners of internet conspiracy culture, a more dramatic version of the McCasland story took hold. This version, which has less to do with serious UFO research and more to do with the mythology-building tendencies of online conspiracy communities, suggested something far more sensational, that McCasland had disappeared. that he had been silenced, that after his retirement he had effectively ceased to exist in the public record, and that this absence was evidence of something deeply sinister. It is worth being direct about this version of the story. It does not hold up. Neil McCasland is a real person with a documented military career and a conventional retirement. There is no verified evidence that he disappeared in any meaningful sense. There is no credible claim that he was silenced by any government agency. The absence of a public profile after retirement, which is the primary evidence offered for the disappearance narrative, is not unusual for high-ranking military officers who spent their careers in classified roles. Privacy after a long military career is the norm, not the exception. The internet as a research environment has a particular relationship with absence. When information is absent, the absence itself becomes a kind of evidence. But understanding why the disappearance narrative took hold is itself instructive, because it reveals something important about how conspiracy theories evolve and what they are actually responding to. The internet as a research environment has a particular relationship with absence. When information exists, it can be examined, cross-referenced and challenged. When information is absent, when a person has little or no public digital footprint, the absence itself becomes a kind of evidence. For online researchers trained on the idea that everything leaves a trace, the lack of a trace feels unnatural, it feels like erasure, and erasure in the conspiratorial imagination implies agency. The serious version of the theory does not need McCasland to have disappeared. It does not need him to have been silenced or threatened or erased. The serious version rests on a much quieter and much more durable observation that his career placed him in a specific institutional location, and that the programs connected to that location may have contained information that the public has never been allowed to see. AC-6, 09. The modern analyst and the procurement trail. Imagine a defense analyst, not a conspiracy theorist, not a UFO enthusiast, a person who spends their professional life reading procurement records, congressional budget filings, and defense acquisition documents. A person whose daily work involves tracing the flow of money through the defense establishment, identifying where funding goes, what programs it supports, and how those programs evolve over time. This kind of analyst, working through publicly available but densely technical documentation, would notice something interesting in the records connected to Air Force research and development programs from the period of McCasland's active service. Not smoking guns, not explicit references to recovered extraterrestrial technology, but patterns. Recurring budget line items for programs with descriptions so vague as to be meaningless. Advanced aerospace research, materials characterization programs, long-duration research initiatives, programs that receive consistent funding across multiple budget cycles without ever appearing in any public report on their progress or purpose, programs whose funding histories trace back decades but whose origins are never explained. These are the fingerprints of the black budget world. They do not prove anything specific about the contents of those programs, but they establish conclusively that programs exist within the defense research establishment that have been actively protected from public scrutiny for extended periods. McCasland's name, according to the researchers who have gone deepest into this analysis, appears at several of those transition points, not in a way that is explicitly incriminating. There are no documents bearing his signature that say anything extraordinary, but in a structural sense his tenure in specific oversight roles aligns with key moments in the institutional histories of programs that, based on their funding patterns and their classification profiles, represent the kind of deep black research that the most serious UAP researchers believe may be connected to the management of recovered or engineered non-human technology. The procurement trail does not prove the custodian hypothesis, but it provides it with a factual skeleton, a series of structural observations rooted in real documents that give the theory more than speculation to stand on. The money went somewhere. The programs existed. The oversight structure placed specific people in specific roles at specific times, and one of those people, repeatedly and consistently, was Neil McCasland. ACT-6. 10. The UAP disclosures and the shifting landscape. The years following McCasland's retirement saw a transformation in the public conversation about UFOs and UAP that no serious observer of the subject could have predicted. The transformation was not driven by whistleblowers stepping forward with dramatic revelations, although some of that occurred. It was driven primarily by the American government itself, by a series of gradual, reluctant, and occasionally stunning admissions that changed the institutional landscape entirely. The 2017 New York Times story about a tip was the first major inflection point. For the first time, a serious mainstream news organisation was reporting, with named sources and documented evidence, that the Pentagon had maintained a secret program specifically dedicated to investigating UAP. The program had studied encounters between military pilots and craft that performed manoeuvres inconsistent with any known propulsion system. It had examined materials recovered from unidentified objects. It had produced classified reports describing phenomena that the program's analysts could not explain within the framework of known physics or known human engineering. In the years that followed, the disclosures continued. Military video footage of UAP encounters was officially declassified and released. Congressional hearings on UAP were convened for the first time in decades. Former intelligence officials testified, under oath, about programs they claimed had studied non-human technology. A new government office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, was established specifically to coordinate UAP investigation and reporting. Against this backdrop, the McCasland theory acquired a new relevance, because if AATIP had existed, if a secret Pentagon program studying UAP with a budget and a staff and classified archives had been running for years without public knowledge, then the question of what else existed became not a conspiracy theory, but an obvious and legitimate research question, and the institutional roles that figures like McCasland occupied became not circumstantial background detail, but genuinely significant structural context. The UAP disclosure landscape did not prove the McCasland theory, but it validated the analytical framework that the theory rests on. It confirmed that the government maintains classified programs related to UAP. It confirmed that those programs involve materials and data and findings that have never been shared with the public. And it confirmed that the people who managed those programs, who served in the oversight roles and the research management positions that gave them visibility into the classified landscape, may have known things that no amount of Freedom of Information Act requests will ever fully reveal. Act 6. 11. The continuity of secrets. Here is the aspect of the McCasland theory that serious researchers find most compelling, and that is most difficult to refute: the problem of institutional continuity. Secrets do not maintain themselves. Classification is not a passive condition. It is an active process that requires constant management, constant renewal, constant human attention. Documents must be maintained and periodically re-evaluated. Programs must be funded and staffed. The people who know must be managed, counselled on their obligations, monitored for potential disclosure, replaced when they retire or die. The architecture of secrecy is not a vault that you lock and forget. It is a living system that requires ongoing human labour to maintain. This means that if the United States government has, at any point in the past 70+ years, maintained classified knowledge of extraordinary phenomena recovered, materials, of engineering insights derived from non-human technology, of contact with intelligence, not of terrestrial origin, that knowledge has not simply sat in a sealed room somewhere. It has been actively maintained, actively managed, passed from one generation of custodians to the next, each new generation read into the program's history and bound by the same obligations as those who came before. The people who currently manage whatever the most sensitive programs in the American defense establishment contain are not the people who made the original discoveries. They are inheritors. The people who currently manage whatever the most sensitive programs in the American defense establishment contain are not the people who made the original discoveries. They are inheritors. They were briefed into programs that were already old when they arrived. Programs with histories that stretch back decades. Programs whose origins may have occurred before some of their current managers were born. They carry institutional memory not as personal experience but as classified documentation and structured briefings. McCasland belongs to this framework not as its origin point, but as one of its middle chapters. He is not the person who first encountered whatever the theory suggests he may have encountered. He is a person who, if the theory is correct, inherited custodial responsibility for a secret that predated him by decades. A person who managed, in whole or in part, knowingly or not, the institutional infrastructure through which that secret was maintained during the years of his service. Whether he knew the full nature of what he was managing is, in this framework, almost beside the point. Compartmentalization ensures that even the people within the system may not have complete knowledge of what the system contains. A person can manage the funding and oversight of a classified program without being fully briefed on the program's most sensitive findings. They can ensure the continuity of a secret without knowing all of its contents. They can be, in the most literal sense, a custodian, maintaining the container without always knowing what is inside. ACIT 6:12. The real question. Underneath the theory. The conspiracy theory about Neil McCasland is, on one level, about a specific person and a specific career and a specific set of institutional connections. But on a deeper level, it is about something much larger, something that transcends the details of any individual's biography and touches on one of the most fundamental questions in the relationship between government and public in a democratic society. How much do we not know? That is the real question at the heart of this story. Not, did McCasland know about aliens? That question, however dramatic it sounds, is ultimately a narrow one. The answer may never be known and will, for most purposes, never matter. But the question underneath it, the question about the architecture of classification, about the scope of programs that have never been publicly acknowledged, about the nature and scale of information that the American government has actively maintained as secret for decades. That question has profound implications for how we understand the institutions that govern us. The UAP disclosure process of the past several years has provided partial, carefully managed answers to that deeper question. Yes, classified programs studying UAP have existed. Yes, those programs have encountered phenomena that conventional physics cannot explain. Yes, materials have been recovered and studied. Yes, official government positions have been publicly stated that the people inside the government knew to be incomplete. But the disclosures have been precisely calibrated to reveal as little as possible, while satisfying the minimum requirements of congressional oversight and public pressure. The truly sensitive material, whatever is in the classified, annexes of the UAP reports, whatever the full findings of the deep black programs involve, remains invisible, and the people who know the most about it remain, almost uniformly, inside a silence that is maintained by legal obligation, institutional culture, and the kind of professional identity that comes from spending a career at the highest clearance levels of the most powerful military establishment on Earth. Neil McCasland is, in this larger frame, less a specific subject and more a representative figure. He represents the category of person who occupies the silent centre of this landscape, not the officials who have come forward to speak, not the whistleblowers who have taken personal risks to disclose specific claims, but the people who remain inside the silence, the people whose careers touch the most sensitive programs and who retired without saying a word, the people who, for all we know, carry the most complete picture of whatever the truth actually is. Their silence is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is not evidence of anything except the effectiveness of the classification system and the depth of the professional culture that sustains it. But it is a reminder that the architecture of classification creates a permanent epistemic gap between what the government knows and what the public is allowed to know. And that gap, measured in decades of accumulated classification, in programs that have never been acknowledged, in discoveries that have never been shared, may contain things that would fundamentally alter how we understand our world. Epilogue. The Silent Career. Somewhere, tonight, a file exists that has not been opened in years. It sits in a secured archive, inside a building that most people will never enter. behind classification walls that will remain intact long after the people who built them are gone. The file contains records of something. What exactly? We cannot say. Perhaps nothing extraordinary, or perhaps the routine documentation of a classified but entirely mundane research program. Or perhaps something that the people who last read it struggled to understand. Something that arrived decades ago from a direction that no one expected. Something that was carefully contained, carefully studied, and then carefully forgotten by the public institutions responsible for managing what the world was allowed to know. Neil McCasland did not confirm any of this. He has not spoken publicly about the classified programs he oversaw. He has not written a memoir that contains between its lines the weight of secrets kept for decades. He has simply retired, as military officers retire, and withdrawn from public life with the discretion that his entire career trained him to maintain. But his career is documented. His institutional positions are a matter of record. The programs he oversaw, in their broad structural outlines, if not their classified specifics, are identifiable through the procurement, records and oversight documents that form the skeleton of public knowledge about the defence research establishment. And those records, examined carefully and without the distortions of either credulous conspiracy theory or reflexive institutional defence, tell a story about a man who spent decades at the edge of what is known, at the edge of what is acknowledged, at the edge of what the public is allowed to see. Whether he ever looked over that edge, whether his career placed him in direct contact with something extraordinary, or whether the classified programs he managed contained nothing more than the next generation of weapons and sensor systems, is a question that the public record cannot answer. It may never be answered. The classification system is designed to ensure exactly that outcome, and that is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire story. Not the possibility that McCasland knew something extraordinary, not the possibility that the programs he oversaw contained knowledge of non-human technology or contact or recovered materials, but the structural reality that the system is designed to ensure we will never know, that certain knowledge, once it enters the classification architecture, may never fully emerge, that the people responsible for managing that architecture, the custodians, the overseers, the quiet generals who spent their careers behind the wall, retire into silence and take with them whatever they carried. Some individuals spend their entire careers at the edge of knowledge, close enough to see something unusual, close enough to understand that certain questions are never asked in certain rooms, and that certain silences communicate more than any answer ever could, and then they retire, and the edge they stood at remains exactly where it always was, waiting for whoever comes next. Before we begin tonight, I want to give a very special thank you to Indecent. This one came directly from you, and it turned into something I think is genuinely one of the most fascinating things we have ever explored on this channel. If you have a story idea, a conspiracy, a mystery, a piece of hidden history that has been keeping you up at night, drop it in the comments below. You might just find your idea becoming the next Sleep Theories documentary, and if you are listening on Spotify and you have not yet left us a review, please take 10 seconds to do that tonight. It sounds like a small thing, but it genuinely helps more than almost anything else you could do for this channel. It helps new listeners find us, it helps us grow, and it means we can keep making these stories for you. Now, let's begin. There is a shape that appears in the most unexpected places across human history. You will find it carved into the stone temples of ancient Rome. You will find it etched onto the margins of Renaissance manuscripts kept locked in private libraries. You will find it woven into the architectural blueprints of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. It is not a cross. It is not a pyramid. It is a cube. 6 equal faces, perfect and cold, symmetrical in every direction. A form that ancient philosophers once described as the physical boundary of reality itself. And always, in the writings that accompany it, there is a name. A single word, repeated across 2,000 years of hidden correspondence and philosophical debate and secret ceremony. That word is Saturn. Tonight, we are going to follow that word. We are going to follow it from the smoke-filled festival grounds of ancient Rome, where for one extraordinary week every year the entire structure of civilization was turned upside down. We are going to follow it through the lamplit studies of Renaissance scholars who believed they had rediscovered a cosmological truth so powerful it had been deliberately buried. We are going to follow it into the present day, where a researcher named Elias Mercer sits surrounded by maps and photographs and centuries-old documents and asks a question that once asked cannot easily be unasked. The question is this: what if certain people have always understood something about time and civilization that the rest of us are only beginning to see? What if a network of thinkers, stretching back further than we can comfortably imagine, has been quietly guiding the great institutions of Western society, not through force, not through domination, but through patience, through the slow, deliberate application of a philosophy that measures progress not in years, not in decades, but in centuries? What if the symbol of that philosophy is still watching us from the logos and the monuments and the architectural details of the world we move through every single day? This is the Saturn Directive. Act 1. The Ancient Route. To understand what comes next, you have to understand what Rome was in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Not the Hollywood version, not the marble columns and the gleaming senators in white togas. The real Rome of 217 BC was something messier and more human and more interesting than any film has ever managed to capture. It was a city of approximately 300,000 people crowded inside a set of ancient walls, a city that smelled of animals and fire and the river Tiber, a city that was at that precise moment engaged in a war against Carthage that it was not certain it would win. The Battle of Lake Trasimene had just destroyed a Roman army. 17,000 soldiers were dead. The General Flaminius lay among them. The Carthaginian commander Hannibal Barca was moving through the Italian peninsula with an army that had already crossed the Alps in winter, had already defeated Rome twice, and showed no sign of slowing. Rome was afraid, and when Rome was afraid, Rome turned to its gods. In the year 217 BC, the Roman Senate made a decision that would echo across the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. They elevated Saturnalia, already an ancient festival honouring the god Saturn, to a new level of cultural prominence and official state support. For 7 days in the month of December, the rules changed, not metaphorically, not symbolically. They changed in practice, on the streets, in every household, in every marketplace from the forum to the docks on the Tiber. Masters served their slaves at table. The social hierarchy, the rigid, absolute, legally enforced hierarchy that structured every moment of Roman daily life, was suspended. People exchanged gifts. Schools closed. Courts closed. No criminal could be punished during Saturnalia. The streets filled with feasting and noise, and a kind of collective permission to be different, to be equal, to imagine a world other than the one that existed, the rest of the year. The philosopher Macrobius, writing 5 centuries later, described it as a festival in which the world remembered the age of Saturn, the Golden Age, before inequality, before private property, before the great social machinery of civilization had separated human beings into ranks of those who commanded and those who obeyed. Saturn, in the Roman theological imagination, was a god of extraordinary complexity. He was the deity of agriculture, of seeds planted in dark soil, of the patient invisible work of transformation that happens underground before anything appears in the light. He was the god of time, often depicted holding a scythe or an hourglass, the harvester of years as surely as he was the harvester of grain. And he was something older and stranger still, a figure connected to what the Romans called the cosmic order, the invisible architecture of reality that underlies all the visible arrangements of power and civilization. The Roman mythological tradition held that Saturn had once ruled over a paradise, a time before the gods of Olympus, before Jupiter seized power and imposed the present imperfect world. In that earlier age, humanity had lived without labour, without want, without the grinding apparatus of social hierarchy. Saturnalia was not merely a celebration. It was, in a very precise sense, a ritual memory. 7 days out of every year, Rome remembered what had been lost, and what might, in some distant future cycle of cosmic time, be recovered. But here is the detail that certain later scholars found most interesting, and that would eventually become the seed of an entire tradition of hidden philosophical thought. Saturn was not merely a deity of the past. He was, in the Roman cosmological framework, the planet furthest from the sun that the naked eye could see. He was, in the language of ancient astronomy, the boundary, the outermost limit of the visible solar system. Beyond Saturn lay only the unknown. Beyond Saturn, the ancient astronomers believed, lay the fixed stars, eternal and unreachable. Saturn was the wall between the human world and the infinite, the boundary between what can be known and what cannot, the limit of time itself. For 260 years after that decision in 217 BC, Saturnalia remained one of the central festivals of Roman civic life. It grew more elaborate with each generation. By the time of the Emperor Augustus, it had expanded to 7 days and had absorbed into itself a complex web of ritual and philosophy and social meaning that extended far beyond its agricultural origins. The Roman poet Catullus called it the best of days. The philosopher Seneca complained that it had become too raucous, too commercial, too far removed from its original spiritual gravity, a complaint that every generation makes about its holidays, and that tells you in its way that the festival had become thoroughly embedded in the texture of Roman life, and then Rome fell. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse all at once. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened in 476 AD. The date that historians give for the fall of Rome, the year when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last emperor, the young and mostly powerless Romulus Augustulus. That date is a convenience, a marker, a line drawn in a textbook where in reality there was no line, only a long and complicated and painful dissolution that had been underway for more than a century before anyone bothered to call it an end. What did disappear, and disappear relatively quickly, was the official apparatus of Roman religion. The old priesthoods lost their state funding. The temples were converted or demolished. The great sacrificial traditions, the auguries, and the flame-tending and the public ceremonies that had structured Roman spiritual life for 1,000 years, these lost their institutional support and their official legitimacy with extraordinary speed once Christianity became the state religion of the empire under Constantine in the early 4th century. Saturnalia itself was eventually banned, or rather, it was absorbed. The Christmas traditions of gift exchange and feasting, and the suspension of normal rules show the unmistakable fingerprints of Saturnalia's long cultural shadow. pressed into the new festival like a hand in wet cement. The scholars who study this transition debate endlessly about whether the borrowing was deliberate or simply inevitable, the natural tendency of new cultural systems to fill themselves with the emotional furniture of the old ones they replace. But what happened to the knowledge? What happened to the priesthoods, the philosophical schools, the tradition of Saturn study that had flourished in Rome not merely as popular religion but as sophisticated cosmological inquiry? What happened to the men and women who had devoted their lives to understanding what Saturn represented? Not the myth, but the philosophy, the deep structure argument about time and cycles and the hidden architecture of civilization. The official records are, at this point, largely silent, and silence in history is rarely innocent. Several early medieval chronicles note, almost in passing, that certain Roman philosophical societies did not dissolve with the empire. They went underground, they changed their names, they affiliated with monasteries or with the new Christian intellectual establishment in ways that gave them cover and continuity without requiring them to abandon their actual beliefs. The historian who reads these passing references carefully enough begins to notice a pattern, not of disappeared knowledge, but of submerged knowledge. Knowledge that went somewhere when Rome fell. Knowledge waiting. Act 2. The Hidden Tradition. Florence, in the 1400s, was the most intellectually alive city in the Western world. This is not an overstatement. The Florentine Renaissance was not merely an artistic movement. It was an epistemological revolution, a complete renegotiation of what human beings believed it was possible to know, to create, and to become. The Medici family, the great banking dynasty that controlled Florence and funded much of what we now call the Renaissance, were doing something more interesting than simply commissioning beautiful art. They were deliberately, consciously, systematically recovering the ancient world. They were sending agents to Constantinople and Athens and the monasteries of the Byzantine East to purchase manuscripts, Greek texts, Latin texts, and most significantly for our story, Hermetic texts, the ancient philosophical and cosmological writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which mixed Egyptian, Greek, and Roman ideas into a synthesis that Renaissance scholars found electrifying. In 1462, Cosimo de' Medici received a collection of manuscripts from a travelling scholar and immediately ordered Marsilio Ficino, his personal translator and the most gifted classicist in Europe, to drop everything else and translate them. Cosimo was an old man by then, dying, and he told Ficino that he needed to read these texts before he died. They were that important. Ficino translated them in a matter of months, working at a pace that astonished his contemporaries, and the result, the Corpus Hermeticum, became one of the most influential philosophical texts of the Renaissance, shaping the thought of everyone from Pico della Mirandola to Giordano Bruno, to the architects of early modern science. Inside these texts, Saturn appeared again. Not the Saturn of popular Roman religion, not the Saturn of Saturnalia and feasting and role reversal. A different Saturn, a philosophical Saturn. A Saturn described as the outermost boundary of the material universe, the point at which physical reality gives way to the cosmic order that underlies it. The Hermetic Saturn was associated with lead, the heaviest of the traditional 7 metals, cold and dark and patient. He was associated with melancholy, with the capacity to see beyond the surface of things, with a kind of profound and uncomfortable wisdom that came from sustained contemplation of time's passage and civilization's fragility. The Hermetic tradition described Saturn not as a deity to be worshipped, but as a principle to be understood. The principle of limitation, of structure, of the invisible frameworks that make visible order possible. And in the hands of the Renaissance philosophers who absorbed this tradition, that principle began to take on a new and specifically political dimension. If Saturn represented the hidden structure that underlies civilizational order, then understanding Saturn meant understanding something that ordinary political leaders, kings, popes, generals, merchants, did not and could not understand. It meant understanding the long cycles of history, the deep rhythms of rise and fall that no individual lifetime was long enough to observe, the patterns that only became visible if you could somehow position yourself outside the ordinary flow of time and look at history the way an astronomer looks at the movement of planets, tracking not days or years but centuries, not individual events but the slow, inevitable repetitions that shape the fate of entire civilizations. This was the idea that began circulating in the secret intellectual societies of Renaissance Europe. Not in public, never in public. The church was watching, and the church had very clear ideas about what kinds of cosmological speculation were acceptable and what kinds were not. But in private correspondence, in the coded language of Hermetic allegory, in the philosophical conversations that happened in the private gardens and libraries of the great humanist scholars, a new way of thinking about power and time was taking shape. The symbol that these thinkers gathered around was Saturn's cube. The cube had been associated with Saturn since at least the Pythagorean tradition of ancient Greece, which identified each of the 5 regular geometric solids with one of the elements of the cosmos. The cube, with its 6 equal faces, its perfect 3-dimensional symmetry, its quality of being bounded in all directions, was associated with Earth, with matter, with the physical world. But in the Hermetic synthesis that the Renaissance scholars were developing, the cube took on an additional meaning. It became the symbol of material reality itself. Not Earth in the sense of soil and stone, but reality in the philosophical sense of the structured, bounded, rule-governed world in which human civilization exists. Saturn, as the boundary between the material and the cosmic, was the keeper of the cube, the administrator of the framework, the entity, or rather the principle, that maintained the structures within which human history played out. A small number of Renaissance scholars became convinced that this was not merely an interesting philosophical idea, it was a practical one. If the cycles of history were real, if civilizations genuinely did rise and fall according to predictable rhythms, then it was theoretically possible to understand those rhythms and to act on that understanding. Not to stop the cycles. Saturn was, after all, the god of inevitability. No one stops time, but perhaps to navigate them, to prepare, to position certain institutions, certain ideas, certain lineages of thought, in places where they would survive the inevitable collapses and be available to shape what came after. This was the philosophical foundation, scholars would later argue, of what became the Order of Saturn. Act 3. The Symbolism and its Secrets. Before we follow the Order into the Enlightenment, it is worth pausing to look carefully at the symbolism itself, because the symbolism is in many ways the most compelling part of this story. It is where the abstract philosophical claims meet the visible physical world, and it is where a researcher like Elias Mercer, who we will come to shortly, finds his first threads. The cube appears everywhere once you begin looking for it. The Kaaba in Mecca, the black stone structure at the centre of the world's largest annual pilgrimage, is a cube. The ancient Roman festival of Saturn involved the ritual wrapping of Saturn's image in white wool, concealing and protecting the deity, a practice that some scholars connect to the Kaaba's black cloth covering, though the historical connection is contested. The tefillin boxes worn by observant Jewish men during prayer are small cubes. The ancient Roman augurs, the priests who read the will of the gods, worked within a rectangular bounded space called the templum, a word from which we get both temple and the concept of contemplation. These are facts. Their connection is the subject of intense scholarly debate. Saturn's ring, the structure that makes the planet immediately recognisable to any child who has ever looked through a telescope, is a circle, a cycle made visible, and the association between Saturn and rings, between the planet and cyclical time, predates the invention of the telescope by millennia. Ancient astronomers could not see Saturn's rings directly. They were not resolved as rings until Galileo observed them in 1610, and he did not understand what he was seeing. He thought Saturn was a triple planet. Christian Huygens correctly identified the rings in 1655, and yet ancient Roman texts consistently associate Saturn with circular structures and cyclical time. Whether this is coincidence or something more interesting is one of the questions that Saturn researchers have never fully resolved. Then there is the hexagon. In 2007, NASA's Cassini spacecraft, orbiting Saturn, transmitted images of the planet's north pole that startled planetary scientists. There, at the exact geometric north of the gas giant, was a massive atmospheric formation, a persistent, stable, hexagonal storm system approximately 29,000 kilometers across. A six-sided geometric pattern in a planetary atmosphere, a phenomenon that fluid dynamics can explain through the behavior of rotating gases in certain physical conditions, but that remains one of the most visually striking features in the solar system. The hexagon has persisted, unchanged in its basic structure, for at least the 40 years that we have been able to observe it. It rotates at the same speed as Saturn's interior. It is so precise in its geometry that when you measure its angles, they come within a fraction of a degree of a perfect hexagon. This is where the researchers who study Saturn's symbolism find themselves in a strange position, because the hexagon, the six-sided geometric form, appears repeatedly in the oldest Saturn-related symbolism that we have. Not in every tradition, not in every context, but with enough frequency and in enough different cultural contexts that its presence feels significant to those who study these patterns. Ancient alchemical texts use hexagonal imagery in Saturn-related diagrams. The Star of David, the six-pointed star which is geometrically related to the hexagon, has connections, through complex and contested historical chains, to Saturn symbolism in certain medieval traditions. Beehives, whose hexagonal cell structure represents perhaps the most efficient geometric packing in nature, have been associated with cyclical time and cosmic order in multiple ancient cultures. Scientists explain the Saturnian hexagon through fluid dynamics. The physics are well understood. A rotating fluid in certain conditions naturally forms polygonal standing wave patterns, and Saturn's atmospheric conditions happen to produce a hexagonal one. There is nothing mysterious about the physics, but the question that Elias Mercer found himself unable to stop asking was this: how did ancient cultures develop an association between Saturn and hexagonal geometry centuries before anyone could have observed that geometry? Was it inference from some other property of the planet? Was it coincidence? The hexagon is, after all, a common geometric form, and Saturn is one of only a handful of naked-eye planets. Or was there some other pathway by which very old knowledge about Saturn's actual geometric properties found its way into ancient symbolism? Mercer does not claim to have an answer to this question. What he has is a pattern. And patterns, as any investigator will tell you, are where investigations begin. Act 4. The Order of Saturn. The historical evidence for a formal organisation called the Order of Saturn is fragmentary, contested, and in some places openly disputed by mainstream historians. This needs to be said clearly because what follows is a reconstruction based on the kind of evidence that historians handle with caution. References in private correspondence, marginal annotations in manuscripts, the occasional explicit mention in texts whose authenticity has been questioned. The story of the Order of Saturn is not established history. It is something more interesting and more uncomfortable than that. It is the story of what certain historical documents seem to suggest, placed alongside a pattern of real events that the suggestion, if true, would help to explain. With that said, here is what Elias Mercer found. Sometime in the late 17th century, in the intellectual ferment of the early Enlightenment, a group of scholars with connections to the surviving Hermetic and Rosicrucian traditions of Renaissance Europe appears to have formalised what had previously been a loosely organised philosophical tendency into something more structured. Mercer describes finding references to this group in 3 separate archival sources: a collection of letters from a Dutch natural philosopher, a marginal note in a copy of Newton's correspondence held in a private library, and a fragment of a longer document in a German archive that appears to describe the group's founding principles. The name that appears in these sources, sometimes directly, sometimes in coded reference, is the Order of Saturn, or, in Latin, the Ordo Saturni. The founding members appear to have been drawn from the interconnected world of early modern European scholarship, the network of natural philosophers, mathematicians, alchemists, and political theorists who were simultaneously inventing modern science, and trying to preserve the older philosophical traditions that they feared modern science might displace. They were, in other words, people who lived at the intersection of two worlds: the world of empirical inquiry that was rapidly transforming European knowledge, and the world of ancient wisdom traditions that had shaped European thought for a millennium and a half. What the Order of Saturn appears to have believed, based on the fragmentary documents Mercer assembled, was a refined version of the Renaissance philosophical position that we have already described. History moves in cycles, civilizations rise and fall according to rhythms that can be studied and, to a limited extent, predicted. Individual political leaders, working within the constraints of their own short lives and shorter political careers, are constitutionally incapable of governing for the long term. They cannot resist the pressures of their own moment. They cannot sacrifice short-term advantage for long-term stability. They cannot plan across generations because they will not live across generations. But institutions can, and ideas can, and networks of people who share a common framework for understanding civilizational time can act, collectively and across generations, in ways that no individual leader ever could. The Order's alleged doctrine held that the proper role of such a network was not to seize power. That would be a misunderstanding of what power actually is and how civilization actually works. Power seized is power that must be defended, and defending seized power consumes all the energy that should be directed toward long-term planning. The Order's doctrine, as Mercer reconstructs it, was something more subtle and more patient. The role of the Saturn thinkers was to be present, embedded in the institutions of their time, contributing to their functioning, trusted by their colleagues, while quietly orienting those institutions toward the long view, toward decisions that would bear fruit not in the next election cycle, or the next quarter's results, but in the next generation, or the generation after that. Saturn was their symbol, because Saturn, in the ancient cosmological imagination, was the planet of patience, of slow, inevitable, irresistible motion, of time working on a scale that dwarfed human politics. To orient yourself by Saturn was to orient yourself by the longest timeline imaginable, to think not about what you wanted to accomplish in your lifetime, but about what needed to be built that would last across centuries. The black cube, Saturn's geometric symbol, the emblem of material structure and civilizational framework, became the Order's emblem, not displayed openly, not used as a public identifier, but carried as an internal reference point, a philosophical anchor, a reminder of what the work was actually about. Three things: structure, time, patience. Act 5. The Modern Investigation. Elias Mercer did not set out to investigate secret societies. He set out to write a book about architectural symbolism in global financial centres, a fairly conventional academic project about how the design of major banking and trading institutions reflects and reinforces certain ideas about power and permanence. He had a publisher interested, a university affiliation, and a methodology drawn from the well-established field of iconographic analysis. He was going to look at buildings and describe what their symbols meant. The project changed shape on him gradually, the way research always does when it is being done honestly. The first unexpected thing he noticed was the cube. Cube-shaped monuments appear in an extraordinary number of major financial centres around the world. Not universally, this is not a case of every major bank having a cube outside its door, but with a frequency that exceeded what Mercer's initial framework could easily explain. The Charging Bull sculpture near Wall Street in New York sits in Bowling Green, adjacent to a small cube-shaped structure that most people walk past without noticing. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, the so-called Bank of Central Banks, the institution that coordinates monetary policy across the global financial system, has cube-related geometric motifs embedded in its official imagery. Several significant financial institutions in the City of London use geometric forms in their architectural detailing that carry, to a trained iconographic eye, clear resonances with the hermetic Saturn symbolism of the Renaissance tradition. Individually, each of these observations is explicable. Cubes are a basic geometric form. Architects use them because they are structurally efficient and visually clean. There is no reason to attach significance to the appearance of a cube in an otherwise unremarkable piece of institutional architecture. Mercer knew this. He did not set out to build a conspiracy theory. He set out to note an interesting pattern and develop some possible explanations for it. The second unexpected thing was the institutional logos. Mercer began tracking the visual identity systems, the logos, the official seals, the heraldic devices of a selected group of institutions that he was including in his study. These included major central banks, certain international governance organisations, several prominent private financial institutions, and a small number of long-established think tanks and policy research bodies. What he found when he laid these images alongside the iconographic record of Saturn symbolism that he had assembled from Renaissance sources was a pattern of visual resonance that he found difficult to dismiss. Ring imagery. Not literal planetary rings, nothing that obvious, but circular forms, ring-like structures, the visual grammar of a cyclical enclosure that had characterized Saturn symbolism since the Hermetic texts of the Renaissance. This grammar appeared in institutional visual identities with a regularity that, Mercer argued, exceeded what random design choices would produce. He was careful to frame this as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. He acknowledged the possibility of coincidence. He acknowledged the influence of general classical and Renaissance visual traditions on the design sensibilities of institutions founded during the 18th and 19th centuries, the peak centuries of the Order of Saturn's alleged influence. He acknowledged that most of the designers who created these logos almost certainly had no awareness of the specific symbolic tradition he was tracing. That was, in a way, part of the point. If the Order of Saturn had operated in the way that Mercer's documents suggested, not through overt control but through the shaping of institutional culture over generations, then you would not expect to find a smoking gun. You would not find a memo saying, "Please incorporate Saturn symbolism into the bank's logo as a sign of our allegiance." What you would find is what Mercer did find, a diffuse, pervasive, culturally embedded tendency toward a particular visual vocabulary, a vocabulary whose origins had been forgotten but whose influence persisted in the way that all deep cultural inheritances persist, invisibly, powerfully, without anyone needing to consciously choose it. The third unexpected thing was the most unsettling of all. It was the cycles. Act 6. The cycle theory. The ancient Roman texts that described Saturn as the ruler of time were not merely making a theological claim. They were making something that looked, from a certain angle, like an empirical one. The concept of the great year, the idea that history moves in long cycles, that civilizations rise and fall according to rhythms that repeat across centuries, is one of the oldest ideas in human philosophy. You find it in Plato, you find it in the Hindu concept of the Yuga cycles, you find it in the Mayan long count calendar, you find it in various forms in virtually every culture that has attempted to think seriously about the deep structure of historical time. Modern historians are, on the whole, sceptical of cyclical theories of history. The dominant tradition in academic historiography holds that history is contingent, that it is shaped by specific individuals, specific decisions, specific chains of cause and effect, and that grand cyclical theories tend to be too neat, too schematic, too satisfying in ways that obscure the genuine complexity and unpredictability of historical events. This is a reasonable position. The history of cyclical theory is also the history of people reading patterns into random distributions, of confirmation bias operating on the vast and multifarious record of the human past. But Mercer was not making a strong historical claim. He was making a narrower and in some ways more interesting observation. He was pointing out that major civilizational crises, defined as periods of simultaneous military conflict, economic disruption, and significant political instability affecting multiple major powers, appear to cluster around intervals of roughly 70 to 90 years. Consider the spacing. The Napoleonic Wars and their attendant economic disruptions concluded around 1815. The next major clustering of civilizational crisis, the events surrounding the First World War, the Spanish influenza pandemic, the revolutionary upheavals in Russia and elsewhere, concentrated around 1914 to 1919. that is approximately 100 years. The Second World War and its attendant genocides and economic disruptions concentrated around 1939 to 1945. That is approximately 25 to 30 years after the First World War, closer in spacing, but the two events can reasonably be understood as phases of a single extended crisis rather than separate cyclical events. The Cold War's period of maximum tension concentrated in the late 1950s through the early 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the construction of the Berlin Wall, the nuclear standoffs, that is roughly 15 to 20 years after the end of the Second World War, and then a long pause. A period of relative great power stability, marked by proxy conflicts and regional wars, but not by direct confrontations between major powers. A period that is, by historical standards, unusually peaceful and unusually prosperous at the civilizational level. The scholars who study the historical sociology of conflict, researchers like Neil Howe and William Strauss, who developed the concept of the saeculum, or Peter Turchin, whose field of cliodynamics attempts to apply mathematical modelling to historical cycles, have independently noted the tendency of major social crises to cluster around generational turning points. The reasoning is not mystical, it is demographic and sociological. Generations that have lived through catastrophe build institutions designed to prevent its recurrence. Those institutions gradually calcify. The memory of the catastrophe fades, the generation that carries, but memory dies. And without the memory, the institutional safeguards that the memory motivated begin to erode, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, until the conditions for a new catastrophe have reassembled themselves and the cycle begins again. Mercer's Saturn researchers, he argued, had understood this mechanism, or something like it, for centuries. Not through the supernatural authority of a planetary deity, but through sustained observation of the historical record. Saturn was their symbol not because they believed in literal astrology, but because Saturn, as the slowest moving of the naked eye planets, provided a useful metaphor for the kind of time that their analysis required. Saturn's orbit takes approximately 29.5 years to complete. 3 Saturn orbits make approximately 88.5 years, precisely the range that Mercer identified for major civilizational crisis intervals. This correspondence may be coincidence. Mercer did not claim otherwise, but he noted it, carefully and without overstating its significance, as the kind of convergence that made the Saturn tradition's choice of symbol feel less arbitrary than it might otherwise appear. Act 7. The Strategic Doctrine. The manuscript fragment that Mercer found in the German archive, the document that he believed contained the clearest statement of the Order of Saturn's actual doctrine, is a damaged and incomplete text. Several sections are illegible. The authorship is uncertain. The provenance is unclear. Mercer published a transcription and translation of the legible portions in an appendix to his book, with appropriate scholarly caveats about its authenticity and interpretation. He was careful not to overstate what the fragment proved, but he was also clear about what it said. The fragment describes what it calls the Saturn Doctrine. It is worth quoting the key passage in full as Mercer translates it, because the language is striking in its directness. Written in a mixture of Latin and early modern German, the passage reads as follows. In Mercer's translation, the ordinary man of politics imagines that power consists in commanding the present. He struggles to control today's events, today's alliances, today's public opinion. He is like a farmer who plants seeds and expects to harvest them the same afternoon. He does not understand what seeds are for. True power is not controlling people today. True power is guiding the next century. It is placing certain ideas in certain institutions at certain moments, and then waiting, with the patience of Saturn, with the indifference of time, for those ideas to bear fruit in the minds of people not yet born. This is the doctrine. Plant the seed. Do not wait for the harvest. Leave the harvest for those who will come after you, who will themselves plant seeds for those who will come after them. Generation after generation, patient and invisible, guiding the great ship of civilization not by seizing the wheel, but by adjusting the currents through which it moves. Mercer does not know who wrote this. He cannot verify that the Order of Saturn is the organization being described. He cannot confirm that the fragment dates from the period he believes it dates from. The the early 18th century, the High Enlightenment, rather than from a later period or even from a much more recent attempt at historical fabrication. These are genuine uncertainties, and he presents them as such. What he can say is that the ideas expressed in the fragment align precisely with what the philosophical record suggests the Order of Saturn believed, and that these ideas, the idea of generational strategic planning, of embedding long-term vision in institutions rather than individuals, of accepting that the most significant work of civilization building happens invisibly and across timescales that no individual can witness. These ideas appear throughout the history of the organizations and institutions that Mercer's pattern analysis identifies as potentially connected to the Saturn tradition. They appear in the founding documents of the earliest central banks, which were designed explicitly to outlast any individual government and to maintain monetary stability across political cycles. They appear in the mission statements of the great research universities that were established or fundamentally restructured in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, institutions explicitly designed to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. They appear in the charters of the international governance bodies that were created after both world wars, organisations whose explicit purpose was to prevent the recurrence of catastrophe by building institutional frameworks that would shape the behaviour of future leaders who had not lived through the catastrophes that motivated the institution's creation. These are all real institutions. Their founding documents say what Mercer says they say. The question is whether this reflects conscious adherence to a philosophical tradition centred on Saturn symbolism, or whether it simply reflects the reasonable and independently derived conclusion that human civilization requires long-term thinking, a conclusion that many people, in many contexts, have reached without any connection to any secret order whatsoever. This is the question that the Saturn Directive ultimately cannot answer, and perhaps that is the most honest thing about it. Act 8. Hidden in plain sight. Let us do something that documentary investigations almost never do. Let us sit with the ambiguity. Most stories like this one resolve toward one of two conclusions. Either the conspiracy is real, the evidence is overwhelming, the connections are unmistakable, the Order of Saturn has been pulling the strings of Western civilization for centuries and here is the proof. Or the conspiracy is false, the pattern-seeking mind has done what pattern-seeking minds always do, found connections in noise, projected significance onto coincidence, constructed a narrative where there is only random history. Elias Mercer does not choose between these conclusions, and this, the scholars who have engaged seriously with his work suggest, is the most intellectually honest position available. Here is what we actually know. We know that Saturn was one of the most philosophically rich and symbolically complex figures in the ancient Roman tradition, associated with time, with cycles, with the hidden architecture of civilizational order. We know that this tradition was preserved, adapted, and substantially developed during the Renaissance through the recovery of Hermetic texts. We know that intellectual societies formed during the Enlightenment drew heavily on Renaissance Hermetic thought, and that several of these societies were explicitly interested in the long-term dynamics of civilizational change. We know that many of the most significant institutions of the modern world, central banks, international governance bodies, major research universities, were founded during the period of maximum Enlightenment philosophical activity and reflect, in their foundational documents, ideas about generational planning and civilizational stability that align with the Saturn tradition as Mercer describes it. We also know that these same ideas could have been, and in many cases demonstrably were, independently derived by thoughtful people responding to the obvious lessons of history. You do not need to be a member of a secret order devoted to a planetary deity to conclude that institutions should be designed to outlast individual leaders, or that civilizations require long-term thinking, or that the short attention spans of democratic politics are genuinely dangerous. These are not secret insights. They are widely shared conclusions available to anyone who studies history with sufficient seriousness. What Mercer's investigation leaves us with is something subtler than a simple true or false verdict on the Order of Saturn's existence. it leaves us with a question about the relationship between explicit conspiracy and cultural inheritance. Even if no one has ever sat in a candlelit room and sworn allegiance to the principle of Saturn and the symbol of the black cube, even if the Order of Saturn is, in the end, a philosophical tradition that was never formalised into an actual organisation, it remains true that certain ideas about civilizational time and long-term power have persisted across centuries, embedded in the institutions and symbols and intellectual frameworks of Western civilization. It remains true that these ideas have shaped the behaviour of real people in real organisations in ways that are historically significant. It remains true that the symbol of Saturn, the ringed planet, the scythe-bearer, the keeper of the cube, appears in places that reward careful attention. Whether there was ever an order, or whether the order was always simply the order of things, the invisible structure of ideas persisting across time, is, in the end, perhaps a distinction without a difference. Act 9. The North Polar Hexagon. There is one last detail that Mercer returns to repeatedly in his writing, and that we want to spend a moment with before we reach our conclusion. It is the hexagon, the hexagonal storm at Saturn's North Pole, the atmospheric formation that Cassini photographed in 2007, and that has been continuously monitored since then, is approximately 2 times wider than the entire planet Earth. It has been stable in its basic hexagonal form for as long as we have been able to observe it, which is to say for at least 40 years and possibly much longer. The individual clouds within the hexagon rotate and shift and change. The hexagonal boundary itself persists. Scientists describe it as a standing wave pattern in Saturn's atmosphere, maintained by the planet's rapid rotation and the dynamics of its interior heat. The physics are well established and well understood. The hexagon is not a mystery in the scientific sense. It is an unusual and striking phenomenon, but it has a clear physical explanation. What Mercer finds remarkable, and what he is careful to present as an observation rather than a conclusion, is the persistence of hexagonal imagery and Saturn symbolism across cultures and centuries that could not possibly have had access to telescopic observation of the planet. The hexagon, as a geometric form, is associated with Saturn in texts that predate Galileo by millennia. The Hermetic manuscripts of the Renaissance use hexagonal figures in diagrams, explicitly labelled as relating to Saturn's influence. Medieval alchemical traditions connect the hexagon to the Saturnine principle of material structure. Certain ancient Jewish mystical texts, in their discussions of cosmic geometry, place Saturn in relationship to six-fold structures in ways that later scholars have found striking. None of this proves anything. The hexagon is a common geometric form that appears in many natural contexts: bee honeycombs, basalt columns, crystal structures, soap bubble arrays. It would be surprising if no ancient symbolic system had associated Saturn with hexagonal geometry purely by chance. And the association between Saturn and the hexagon in pre-modern texts may rest on astrological calculations and geometric reasoning that have nothing to do with the planet's actual atmospheric structure. But Mercer's question, the one he cannot stop asking, the one that gives the Saturn directive its particular quality of sustained unease, is this: what would it mean if it were not coincidence? What would it mean if there were some mechanism, some channel of transmission, through which knowledge of Saturn's geometric properties had found its way into ancient symbolism? Not necessarily through extraterrestrial contact or supernatural revelation, the dramatic explanations that the conspiracy tradition typically reaches for, but through some other pathway, some tradition of sustained astronomical observation, some lost mathematical inference, some chain of knowledge transmission so old and so thoroughly buried that its origins have become irrecoverable. We do not know the answer to this question. We may never know it. The historical record before a certain depth becomes opaque, not because the information was hidden necessarily, but simply because time destroys things, and the further back you look, the less survives. What Mercer's investigation suggests is not that we have the answer, but that the question is worth asking, that the pattern is real enough and strange enough and historically widespread enough to deserve more attention than it typically receives from the mainstream academic tradition, which has largely dismissed it. There is something genuinely interesting in the hexagon, in the cube, in the ring, in the symbol of patient, cyclical, invisible time that a Roman festival celebrated 2,000 years ago, and that a damaged manuscript in a German archive describes as the foundation of a doctrine of civilizational patience and generational power, something worth sitting with in the quiet of the night. Act 10. Two possibilities. Elias Mercer ends his investigation with two possibilities. He does not choose between them. He presents them honestly, as the two poles between which his evidence genuinely sits, and he invites his reader, and now, tonight, we invite you to consider which feels more plausible and why, and what that choice reveals about the assumptions you bring to questions like this one. The first possibility is the ordinary one. Saturn symbolism is a recurring philosophical motif in Western culture because the ideas it represents, time, cycles, hidden order, the fragility of civilizational achievement, are genuinely important ideas that thoughtful people in many different periods have independently found compelling. The cube appears in financial architecture because it is a clean, authoritative geometric form that architects have used in institutional contexts for centuries, drawing on a shared classical vocabulary that saturates Western architectural tradition. The hexagon appears in ancient Saturn symbolism for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with the actual geometry of Saturn's atmosphere. The philosophical traditions that emphasize long-term civilizational thinking produced long-lasting institutions because that is what you get when you build institutions designed to last. Institutions that last. There is no order. There is no conspiracy. There is only the human tendency to find patterns in the past, and the human tendency to build forward from the ideas that have proven most durable. This is the comfortable possibility. It is also, Mercer concedes, the most likely one. Most patterns in history are not the result of hidden coordination. They are the result of common circumstances producing common responses, of ideas that work spreading because they work, of cultural inheritance operating through mechanisms so diffuse and distributed that no one is in control of them and no one needs to be. The second possibility is the stranger one. The Order of Saturn exists, not necessarily as a formal institution with membership rolls and meeting minutes, but as a living tradition of shared philosophical commitment, passed across generations through the same mechanisms that all intellectual traditions use: apprenticeship, correspondence, institutional embedding, the patient work of ensuring that certain ideas are available to the right people at the right moments. The people who carry this tradition do not necessarily think of themselves as members of a secret society. They may think of themselves simply as people who understand something about civilizational time that most of their contemporaries do not. They may hold their Saturn symbolism privately as a personal philosophical reference point without ever explicitly connecting it to an organized network. And yet the tradition persists, and its influence on the institutions it has touched persists with it, shaping the decisions of people who have no idea they are enacting a philosophy developed centuries before they were born. This possibility is harder to dismiss than it might seem. Intellectual traditions do persist in exactly this way. The history of philosophy is full of examples of ideas that survive through underground channels, through private correspondence, through the careful embedding of heterodox thought in orthodox institutions, through the patient transmission of knowledge from teacher to student across generations when open expression was impossible. The history of the Hermetic tradition itself is precisely such a history, a tradition that went underground during the inquisitional periods of the medieval church and re-emerged substantially intact during the Renaissance. The history of Freemasonry, of Rosicrucianism, of the various philosophical societies that flourished during the Enlightenment, is the history of intellectual traditions that operated partly in public and partly in private, partly through open discourse and partly through selective transmission to trusted initiates. If the Order of Saturn is one such tradition, if it has operated for centuries on the principle that civilizations require long-term stewardship, and if the people who have carried that principle forward have embedded their influence in the institutions they built and shaped and funded, then the evidence Mercer has assembled is not the evidence of a sinister conspiracy. It is the evidence of a philosophical project. A project whose goals, civilizational, Stability, generational planning, the preservation of institutional knowledge across the destructive cycles of political history are not obviously malign. This does not mean it is entirely benign. Hidden influence, however well-intentioned, is still hidden influence. Decisions made by people who believe they understand civilizational cycles better than their democratically elected contemporaries, and who act on that belief without accountability, are still decisions made outside the frameworks of democratic legitimacy. The benevolence of the Saturn doctrine, if it exists, is the benevolence of the benign authoritarian. We know better, and we are acting for your long-term good, and we are sorry that we cannot explain this to you because you would not understand, and also because the secrecy is itself part of the method. This is, at minimum, a complicated position. It is one that deserves scrutiny, even if, perhaps especially if, the people who hold it are genuinely trying to do good. Epilogue. Saturn still turns. The planet Saturn is, at this moment, approximately 9 astronomical units from Earth. That is 9 times the distance from the Earth to the Sun, approximately 1.3 billion kilometres of cold space, across which Saturn turns in its stately orbit, 29.5 years to complete a single circuit around the star at the centre of our solar system. At its north pole, the hexagonal storm spins in its mathematically precise formation, a geometric regularity in a universe that tends toward chaos, a persistence that has outlasted every empire, every dynasty, every ideological system that human civilization has so far produced and then abandoned. Below the hexagon, in the swirling clouds of hydrogen and helium that make up the planet's vast atmosphere, the physics of rotating gases produces its extraordinary improbable order. 6 sides, each angle precisely 120 degrees, each side approximately 14,000 kilometres long. Perfect. 2,000 years ago in Rome, people gathered to celebrate a festival in honour of a god who represented, among other things, the invisible order underlying visible civilization. They reversed their social hierarchies for 7 days. They exchanged gifts. They remembered a golden age that may never have existed, and in that remembering they kept alive an idea. The idea that the present arrangement of power is not the only possible arrangement, that time changes everything, that what seems permanent is temporary and what seems temporary may prove more durable than anything built of stone. Somewhere, in an archive in Germany, in a private library in Amsterdam, in the architectural details of a building you may have walked past 1,000 times without stopping to look carefully at what was carved above the door, the symbol persists, the cube, the ring, the patient geometry of a tradition that has been thinking for a very long time about what it means to build something that lasts. Whether someone put it there deliberately, as a sign to those who know how to read it, or whether it found its way there through the diffuse and traceless transmission of cultural inheritance, whether the Saturn directive is a plan or merely a tendency, an organisation or merely an idea, is the question that Elias Mercer could not answer. The question that the historical record, rich and fragmentary and beautifully ambiguous as it is, declines to resolve. What we can say with certainty is that the idea is real. The idea that civilizations require long-term stewardship. The idea that the most important work happens slowly, invisibly, across timescales that exceed any individual life. The idea that patience is a form of power, perhaps the deepest and most durable form of power that exists. The idea that Saturn, whatever else it represents, is a symbol of something true about the relationship between time and civilization and the fragile, precious, endlessly threatened project of building human societies that can endure. That idea has been around for a very long time. It will probably be around for a very long time to come, and perhaps that is enough to know. Tonight, wherever you are, whether in a city whose skyline includes buildings whose architects drew from traditions older than they knew, or in a quiet room far from any skyline at all, I want you to carry one image with you into sleep. The image of a planet turning slowly in the dark, 9 times further from the sun than we are, ringed with ice and dust, crowned at its pole with a hexagon that no one should be able to explain, but that has nonetheless been there longer than human civilization has existed. Patient, geometric, turning. Time moves at Saturn's pace, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question the Saturn Directive asks, and refuses to answer, is simply this: is anyone paying attention? Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy these deep dives into history's mysteries, please subscribe. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Dogface680, and we cannot thank you enough for this idea. This is one of the most compelling conspiracy theories rooted in actual Cold War history, and what makes it so haunting is how much of it is documented fact. What you're about to hear sounds impossible. A 4-star general, a war hero, the man who helped liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny, dead in a hospital bed just months after victory, following a minor car accident that shouldn't have killed anyone. No autopsy, no investigation. Medical records vanished, witnesses disappeared, and decades later, a former intelligence operative steps forward with a confession that changes everything. This is the story of General George Smith Patton Jr., the man who won the war but lost the peace, the general who believed he had fought in past lives alongside Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed in destiny and glory and refused to be silent when silence was demanded. This is the story of his mysterious death, and the conspiracy theory that suggests the greatest threat to George Patton wasn't the Nazi Wehrmacht, it was his own government. December 9th, 1945. Near Mannheim, Germany. The war is over. Europe lies in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, railways destroyed, bridges collapsed. Millions dead, millions more displaced. The Third Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, lasted 12 and ended in a Berlin bunker with a gunshot. Victory belongs to the Allies, and General George Smith Patton Jr., the most aggressive, most decorated, most controversial American commander of World War II, sits in occupied Germany with nothing left to conquer. He is 60 years old. His hair is silver. His face is weathered from years of command in the Mediterranean sun, the French countryside, the German winter. He wears his pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, relics of an earlier era when generals still led cavalry charges. He looks like something from another century, and in many ways he is. Patton believes he fought at the walls of Troy. He believes he rode with the Romans into Carthage. He believes he charged with Napoleon at Austerlitz. Past life memories, he calls them. Visions of ancient battles that feel more real than dreams. His officers think he's eccentric. His soldiers think he's touched by God. His enemies learned not to think about him at all until it was too late. But now, in December 1945, Patton is no longer commanding armies. He is no longer shaping strategy. He is no longer needed. The Third Army, which he led across France and into the heart of Germany, has been reassigned. His new command is a paper organisation with no soldiers, no tanks, no mission beyond compiling reports that no one will read. He is waiting to go home, and he is angry. That morning, December 9th, Patton wakes before dawn in his quarters at Bad Nauheim, a spa town north of Frankfurt that serves as headquarters for what remains of his command. He eats breakfast alone, as is his custom. Eggs, toast, coffee. He reviews intelligence reports from the Soviet occupation zone. He reads dispatches from Washington. He writes in his diary, the leather-bound journal he has kept since West Point, filling page after page with his cramped handwriting. Today's entry is bitter. They have sidelined me. Eisenhower fears what I might say. The politicians fear what I might do. The Soviets fear I might be right. So here I sit, a relic, while Europe burns. He signs his name with a flourish, as always. George Smith Patton Jr., 4 stars, Third Army. At 9:30 in the morning, he receives word that a pheasant hunting expedition has been arranged for that afternoon. It's one of his few remaining pleasures, a brief escape from the tedium of meaningless command. His Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, will accompany him. They'll take one of the staff cars, drive south toward Mannheim, spend a few hours in the countryside. It should be routine. At 11 o'clock, Patton descends the stairs of his headquarters building. His boots echo on the marble floors. Officers snap to attention as he passes. He returns their salutes mechanically, his mind already elsewhere, already planning the afternoon hunt, already thinking about the estate where the pheasants run wild. Outside, a Cadillac Model 75 sedan waits. Black paint, chrome trim, the kind of vehicle befitting a general officer. The driver stands beside it, a young private first class who has been assigned to Patton's detail for less than 2 weeks. This is the first irregularity. Patton's regular driver, a sergeant named John Mims, who had driven him for 3 years through combat and occupation, was transferred on December 1st. No explanation was given. Mims, interviewed decades later by researchers, said the transfer was sudden and unusual. He was given orders to report to another unit immediately. He never drove for Patton again. The replacement driver's name is in the accident report, but researchers have never been able to locate his service records. The man seems to have vanished from military documentation after December 9th. Patton climbs into the back seat. General Gay joins him. The driver starts the engine. They pull out of the headquarters compound and onto the road leading south. It's a cold morning. Frost covers the fields. The sky is grey, low clouds threatening snow. The roads are in poor condition, still cratered from the fighting, still littered with debris from the bombardment that reduced Mannheim to ruins earlier in the war. Traffic is light, a few military trucks, some civilian vehicles, German citizens walking along the roadside, bundled against the cold, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. Patton watches the landscape pass. He has driven these roads dozens of times. He knows every turn, every checkpoint, every landmark. At approximately 11:45, near a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim, the car approaches an intersection. A United States Army truck, a 2.5-ton vehicle painted olive drab, approaches from a side road. What happens next takes 3 seconds. The truck makes a sudden left turn, cutting directly across the path of Patton's Cadillac. The driver of the Cadillac swerves right, tyres skidding on the frost-slicked pavement. The vehicles collide, the sound of metal against metal. the crunch of breaking glass, the hiss of steam from a ruptured radiator, and then silence. The driver of the Cadillac climbs out, shaken but uninjured. General Gay opens his door, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. A few bruises, perhaps. Nothing serious. He turns to check on Patton and sees him slumped in the back seat, conscious but unable to move. "My neck," Patton says quietly. "I think my neck is broken." Within minutes, military police arrive. Within an hour, Patton is on his way to Heidelberg. Within days, the official story begins to fracture under the weight of its own inconsistencies. And within 12 days, George Smith Patton Jr. is dead. Chapter 1. The General Who Became a Problem. To understand why conspiracy theories surround Patton's death, you have to understand who Patton was in the final months of his life, and more importantly, what he represented to the emerging Cold War order. George Smith Patton Jr. was never meant for peacetime. He was born into a military family in California in 1885. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy. His father was a politician. Young George grew up hearing stories of cavalry charges and desperate last stands, of honour and glory and the warrior's code. He attended the Virginia Military Institute, then West Point. He competed in the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finishing 5th in the modern pentathlon. He served under General John Pershing in Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa through the desert. He commanded tanks in World War I, was wounded in combat, came home with a chest full of medals and a reputation as a fighter. Between the wars, he studied. He read military history obsessively. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, Frederick the Great, Napoleon. He believed war was an art form, that great commanders were born, not made, that destiny selected certain men for greatness. He believed he was one of those men. When World War II came, Patton was ready. He commanded American forces in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. His Third Army swept across Europe faster than anyone thought possible. His tactics were aggressive, sometimes reckless. He believed in speed and shock and overwhelming force. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy fire. His methods worked. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. They repositioned entire divisions based on intelligence about Patton's location. They assumed wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. Often, they were right. But Patton was more than just a brilliant tactician. He was also politically tone-deaf, personally abrasive, and constitutionally incapable of diplomacy. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, calling them cowards. He gave speeches praising the fighting spirit of the German army. He made jokes about the Holocaust that appalled other officers. He criticised Allied strategy in press conferences. He feuded with British commanders. He defied orders when he thought they were stupid. Eisenhower protected him during the war because Patton won battles. But when the war ended, Patton became expendable. More than that, he became dangerous. Because Patton refused to accept the post-war order. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Allied leaders meet in Potsdam to negotiate the peace. Europe is divided. The Soviet Union takes the east, America and Britain take the west. Borders are redrawn, governments are installed, millions of people are displaced, moved, relocated to fit the new map. Patton watches this happen and sees betrayal. The Allies, he argues, fought to liberate Europe from tyranny. Now they're handing half of Europe to Stalin, a dictator as brutal as Hitler, a regime as totalitarian as the Nazis. He makes this argument publicly. In June 1945, Patton gives a speech in Los Angeles comparing the Soviet Communist Party to the Nazi Party. He calls both totalitarian threats to freedom. He suggests the Allies defeated the wrong enemy, that Germany should have been turned against the Soviet Union instead of being destroyed. The backlash is immediate. Politicians demand his resignation. Newspapers condemn him. The War Department issues official reprimands. President Truman, already dealing with the complexities of Soviet relations, is furious. Eisenhower summons Patton to his headquarters. The meeting does not go well. Eisenhower and Patton were friends once. They rose through the ranks together, served together between the wars, understood each other. But the war changed them both. Eisenhower became a political general, a coalition builder, a man who understood that winning the peace required compromise and patience. Patton remained a warrior who believed wars should be fought without hesitation and won without apology. In Eisenhower's office, Patton is told his public statements are unacceptable. He is ordered to stop criticising Soviet policy. He is warned that further incidents will result in his removal from command. Patton argues back. He presents intelligence reports about Soviet violations of ceasefire agreements. He describes forced population transfers, summary executions, political purges. He insists someone needs to tell the American people what's happening in occupied Europe. Eisenhower tells him that someone is not going to be Patton. The conversation ends badly. Within weeks, Patton is relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper organisation with no operational role. His job now is to compile lessons learned from the European campaign, to write reports analysing tactics and strategy for future military planners. It's a desk job. To a man like Patton, it's worse than death. Internal War Department memos from this period reveal the thinking behind the reassignment. One memo describes Patton as politically dangerous and increasingly uncontrollable. Another warns that Patton's celebrity status among soldiers and veterans makes him a potential political threat to current foreign policy initiatives. A third memo, written by a senior intelligence officer, suggests that Patton's return to the United States should be delayed indefinitely to prevent him from influencing public opinion regarding Soviet intentions. These memos were classified for decades. When they were finally released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, they revealed something important. By October 1945, senior American officials viewed Patton not as an asset but as a liability, and they were actively working to neutralise him. Chapter 2. The Diaries and the Warnings. General Patton kept meticulous diaries throughout his military career. These weren't casual journals. They were detailed historical records, written in his own hand, documenting everything from tactical decisions to personal reflections. He wrote almost every day, sometimes for hours, filling leather-bound volumes with his cramped, precise handwriting. He believed history would vindicate him. He wanted his perspective preserved for future generations. After his death, the diaries were collected by his family. Some entries were published in biographies, others remained private for decades. Some have never been fully released, held back by the Patton family estate for reasons never publicly explained. But the entries that have been made public from October and November 1945 paint a disturbing picture of a man who believed he was being watched, controlled, and silenced. October 2nd, 1945. Patton attends a meeting with Soviet officers to coordinate occupation zones. The meeting is tense. The Soviets refuse to cooperate on prisoner exchanges. They deny Allied access to certain territories. They claim violations of ceasefire agreements that Patton knows are fabricated. He writes, "The Russians are impossible. They lie about everything. They're worse than the Nazis and no one wants to admit it. Eisenhower orders me to maintain diplomatic relations. I'd rather maintain my rifle aimed at their headquarters." October 15th, 1945. Patton inspects Soviet troop positions along the occupation zone boundary. He notes their equipment, their readiness, their disposition. What he sees alarms him. He writes, "Soviet forces are not demobilizing. They're repositioning. They have combat units forward deployed, supply lines established, logistics prepared for offensive operations. If we have to fight them, and I believe we will, we should do it now while our armies are still here, still equipped, still ready. In 2 years, we'll have nothing in Europe, and they'll have everything." October 23rd, 1945. Patton meets with German civilians, former Wehrmacht officers, refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. They tell him stories of mass arrests, forced labour, summary executions, entire villages emptied. He writes, "We promised these people freedom. We told them we were liberating them from tyranny. Now we're handing them to Stalin, who is every bit as brutal as Hitler. The only difference is Stalin is our ally. so we pretend not to see what he's doing. History will judge us harshly for this betrayal. October 31st, 1945. Patton submits a request for extended leave to return to the United States. He wants to visit family, rest, recover from years of combat command. He also wants to speak freely, away from military censorship about what he's witnessed in Europe. The request is denied by the War Department. No explanation is provided. He writes, "They want me here where they can watch me, where they can control what I say, where I can't reach the American people. I understand their game now." November 7th, 1945. Patton has lunch with a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune. The interview is supposed to be off the record, a background briefing about post-war Europe. Patton speaks candidly about Soviet intentions, about Allied failures, about the need for American military readiness. 2 days later, the journalist contacts Patton. The interview has been killed by editors. Someone from the War Department called the newspaper and asked that the story not run. The journalist is apologetic but clear. The article will not be published. Patton writes, "Even the press is controlled now. The truth is too dangerous for the American people to hear. They want everyone to believe we won the war, and everything is fine now. But nothing is fine. Everything we fought for is being given away, and anyone who points this out is silenced." November the 19th, 1945. Patton receives notice that his security detail is being changed. His regular driver, his aides, his bodyguards, men who have served with him for years are being reassigned. New personnel are being assigned to replace them. The official reason is routine rotation of personnel. Patton doesn't believe it. He writes, "They're putting watchers around me, new people who report to someone else. I recognise the pattern. I've used it myself in our intelligence operations. When you want to monitor someone, you put your own people next to them. I'm being treated like a security threat in my own command." November 25th, 1945. Patton's wife, Beatrice, writes him from the United States. She's worried about him. His letters have become dark, paranoid. He writes about being watched, about feeling trapped. She asks if he's well. He writes back, but his response never makes it into his diary. Later, Beatrice told biographers that Patton's letter frightened her. He wrote that he was planning to return home soon, and caused them a lot of trouble. He wrote that he intended to speak publicly about Soviet aggression and Allied failures. He wrote that he knew this would end his military career, but he didn't care anymore. He wrote, "Some fights are worth the cost." December 1st, 1945. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant John Mims, is abruptly transferred to another unit. Mims has driven Patton for 3 years through North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He knows Patton's habits, his routes, his preferences. He's loyal, competent, trusted. The transfer happens overnight. Mims is given orders to report immediately to a quartermaster unit in Belgium. He's not allowed to say goodbye to Patton. A new driver is assigned, a young private first class who's been in the European theatre for less than 3 months. Patton writes, "Even my driver is replaced now. They're not even being subtle about it anymore." This is Patton's last diary entry. 8 days later, he's in the car accident. Chapter 3. The collision that changed everything. December the 9th, 1945. Late morning. General Patton's Cadillac sedan leaves his headquarters in Bad Nauheim at approximately 1100 hours. The sky is overcast, threatening snow. Temperature is just above freezing. The roads are slick with frost but passable. Patton sits in the back seat. He's dressed in his uniform, wearing his leather jacket against the cold. His pearl-handled revolvers are on his hips. He carries a walking stick, an affectation from his days of cavalry service. Major General Hobart Gay sits beside him. Gay has served as Patton's chief of staff throughout the war. He's one of Patton's few remaining friends in the High Command, one of the few officers who still speaks to him regularly after his controversial statements. The new driver, whose name appears in the accident report as Private First Class Horace Woodring, sits behind the wheel. He's nervous. He's only driven for Patton a handful of times. He's not familiar with the general's preferences, his habits, his routes, the drive. should take less than an hour. They follow the main road south from Bad Nauheim, through small German towns still recovering from the war. Mannheim was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. The RAF and American 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons of explosives on its industrial districts. Much of the city centre was destroyed. Rebuilding has barely begun. The roads through Mannheim are in poor condition. Craters from bombs, debris from collapsed buildings. Some streets are still blocked entirely, forcing detours through unfamiliar routes. At 11:43, according to the accident report, Patton's Cadillac approaches a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim. The area is semi-rural, factories mixed with farmland. Traffic is light. A United States Army truck, identified in the report as a GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicle, approaches from a side road on the left. According to the truck driver's statement, taken by military police at the scene, he did not see the Cadillac approaching. He claimed the sun was in his eyes, though the day was overcast. He claimed he was unfamiliar with the intersection, though the road was clearly marked. He claimed he made the turn at normal speed, though witnesses said the truck accelerated suddenly. The Cadillac's driver swerves right to avoid impact. Too late. The vehicles collide at the intersection. Now here's where the official story begins to fall apart. The collision is low speed. The Cadillac is travelling approximately 35 miles per hour. The truck is travelling approximately 15 miles per hour. The impact is glancing, not head-on. The Cadillac's front passenger side strikes the truck's rear cargo area. The damage is minor. The Cadillac's front bumper is bent. The headlight is broken. The hood is dented. The truck's rear panel is scraped but intact. Both vehicles remain operational. The Cadillac's driver, Private First Class Woodring, is uninjured. He has a small bruise on his hand from the steering wheel. Nothing else. Major General Gay is uninjured. He experiences momentary shock from the impact, but suffers no physical trauma. The truck driver is uninjured. He climbs out of his cab without assistance. General Patton, sitting in the back seat of the Cadillac, suffers catastrophic injuries. According to the initial medical assessment, Patton was thrown forward in the collision. His head struck a metal partition or support structure in the car's interior. The impact caused acute cervical spine trauma, specifically a comminuted fracture of the third cervical vertebra and a vertical fracture of the fourth cervical vertebra. The injury results in immediate complete paralysis from the neck down. Multiple forensic analysts who examined the case decades later noted severe inconsistencies with this explanation. First, the injury pattern. A forward impact of the type described should cause predictable trauma. Facial injuries, chest contusions, possibly head trauma. The passenger would hit the seat in front of them, the back of the driver's seat, which is padded. Instead, Patton sustained a precise cervical fracture with no facial injuries, no chest trauma, no head contusions. Second, the biomechanics. For Patton to strike the partition with enough force to fracture his cervical spine, he would need to be travelling at significant speed relative to the car's interior. But the collision was low speed, and Patton was seated wearing his heavy leather jacket, which would have provided some padding. Third, the other passengers, both the driver and General Gay, sitting in front of Patton, experienced minimal impact forces. Gay later described the collision as a solid bump, nothing more. Yet Patton, behind them, experienced forces sufficient to break his neck. One forensic pathologist who reviewed the case in the 1990s suggested the injury pattern was more consistent with a direct blow to the back or side of the neck, the kind of trauma that might result from being struck by a hard object, rather than from impact with a car's interior. Another analyst noted that the specific fracture pattern, comminuted fracture of cervical 3, vertical fracture of cervical 4, is relatively rare in motor vehicle accidents, but more common in cases of direct trauma to the posterior neck. Without an autopsy, without X-rays beyond the initial hospital films, without detailed forensic analysis, these observations remain speculative. But they raise questions. Then there's the matter of the truck driver. According to the accident report, the driver was interviewed by military police at the scene. He provided a statement describing the collision. He was cited for failure to yield, He was released. His name appears in the report as Private Robert Thompson. No unit is listed. No serial number is recorded. No permanent address is given. Researchers have spent decades trying to locate Private Robert Thompson. Military personnel databases have no record of anyone by that name serving in the European theatre in December 1945. The truck's serial number, listed in the accident report, corresponds to a vehicle assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. But when historians tried to trace the vehicle's movement logs, maintenance records, and assignment history, they found nothing. The truck existed on paper, but vanished from all documentation after December 9th. The military police who responded to the scene should have filed detailed reports, taken photographs, secured evidence. Standard accident investigation procedure, especially for a collision involving a 4-star general. No photographs were ever released. The military police reports were classified, then reported lost. No physical evidence from the scene was preserved. Within hours, the Cadillac was repaired and returned to the motor pool. The truck disappeared entirely. And Private Robert Thompson was never seen again. Chapter 4. 12 days in Heidelberg. The Heidelberg Army Hospital in December 1945 was one of the finest medical facilities in Europe. It had treated thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. It had experienced trauma surgeons, skilled nurses, modern equipment for 1940s medicine. The hospital specialised in combat injuries, including complex trauma cases that required intensive care. Spinal injuries like Patton's were rare but not unprecedented. The medical staff understood the protocols: immobilisation, prevention of secondary injury, monitoring for complications, physical therapy when possible. Patton arrived at the hospital at approximately 1300 hours on December 9th, less than 90 minutes after the accident. He was conscious, alert, able to speak. He described the accident to doctors. He reported complete loss of sensation and movement below his neck. He remained calm, even joking with the medical staff. "I've been closer to death than this before," he told one nurse. "I'll be fine." Initial x-rays confirmed the cervical fractures. Neurological examination confirmed complete paralysis below the level of injury, but the attending physicians were cautiously optimistic. The fractures, while severe, showed no signs of spinal cord transection. There was hope that with proper immobilisation and time, some nerve function might return. Complete recovery was unlikely, but partial recovery was possible. Patton was placed in skull traction, a device that immobilised his head and neck to prevent further injury. He was given oxygen support. His vital signs were monitored continuously. Nurses attended him around the clock. On December 10th, one day after the accident, Patton's condition appeared stable. His vital signs were strong. He was communicating with staff. He showed no signs of infection or complications. On December 11th, Patton's wife Beatrice arrived from the United States. The Army had arranged emergency transport, flying her across the Atlantic on a military aircraft. She was escorted by senior officers who had worked to expedite her travel. When she entered Patton's room, he smiled. "I'm in a hell of a fix this time," he told her. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. He couldn't feel it, but the gesture mattered. For the next few days, Patton's condition remained stable. Doctors noted slight improvement in some reflexes. There was cautious talk of eventual transfer to a specialised facility in the United States. Physical therapy was discussed. Patton himself remained optimistic. He made plans. He talked about recovery. He joked about getting back to work. On December 13th, 4 days after the accident, Patton's condition began to change. He developed a slight fever. His breathing became more laboured. Doctors suspected early pneumonia, a common complication in paralysed patients who cannot cough effectively to clear their lungs. Antibiotics were administered. Oxygen support was increased. On December 14th, the fever worsened. Patton's oxygen saturation dropped. His breathing became increasingly difficult. The medical staff worked to keep his airways clear, but the paralysis made it nearly impossible for him to assist in his own treatment. On December 15th, 6 days after the accident, Patton's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. He developed severe pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs. His heart rate became irregular. His blood pressure fluctuated wildly. The doctors diagnosed acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had travelled from his immobilised legs to his lungs. Emergency treatment was initiated, but Patton's condition continued to deteriorate. Over the next 6 days he slipped in and out of consciousness. The fever persisted. The pulmonary edema worsened. His heart struggled to maintain adequate circulation. On December the 21st, 12 days after the accident, at 1750 hours, General George Smith Patton Jr. died. The official cause of death: pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure secondary to his injuries. The death certificate was signed by the attending physicians. The hospital issued a statement expressing condolences. The army notified next of kin. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and then the irregularities began. First, no autopsy was performed. This is unusual for several reasons. Patton was a 4-star general, one of the most prominent military figures in American history. His death under medical care, with unexpected complications arising rapidly, would normally warrant a thorough post-mortem examination. The official explanation was that the family declined an autopsy. But Beatrice Patton later disputed this claim. In interviews with biographers, she stated she was never asked about an autopsy. She said the army simply informed her that her husband's body would be prepared for burial and that no autopsy was necessary or planned. She said she didn't question the decision at the time. She was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed. She trusted the military doctors who told her Patton died of natural complications from his injuries. Only later did she wonder why they were so insistent that no autopsy be performed. Second, Patton's complete medical records from Heidelberg Hospital were never released to the family. Beatrice requested the files multiple times over the following years. She wanted to understand what happened to her husband, why he declined so rapidly, whether everything possible had been done to save him. Her requests were denied. The army told her the medical records were classified for reasons of operational security. She was told the files contained sensitive information about medical procedures and treatment protocols that could not be disclosed. She never received the records. When historians and researchers sought the files decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests, they were told the records were missing. Some reports claim the files were destroyed in the 1960s per routine document retention policies. Other reports claim the files were lost when Heidelberg Hospital closed. Still other reports claim the files are held in classified archives but remain restricted. No one has seen Patton's complete medical records since December 1945. Third, several members of the medical staff who treated Patton were transferred shortly after his death. One surgeon was reassigned to a hospital in Japan. A nurse was transferred to a facility in England. The hospital administrator retired from military service within weeks of Patton's death. When researchers tried to interview these individuals in later years, most declined to participate. Some claimed they couldn't remember details of Patton's case. Others said they were bound by military confidentiality, even decades later. One physician agreed to an interview but died before it could be conducted. One nurse who worked in Heidelberg Hospital during December 1945 gave a brief interview to a researcher in 1976. She described unusual activity in the days before Patton died. She mentioned restricted access to Patton's room. She said only certain staff members were allowed to enter. She described visitors who came late at night, men in military uniforms who weren't logged in the visitor registry. She mentioned medical procedures that weren't part of standard treatment protocols. She said Patton received injections she didn't recognise, medications that weren't listed on his chart. When the researcher pressed for details, the nurse became vague and uncomfortable. She ended the interview abruptly and refused further contact. She died 2 years later. No additional interviews were ever conducted. Fourth, the timeline of Patton's decline doesn't match typical post-injury progression. Spinal injury patients certainly face complications. Pneumonia is common because paralysed patients cannot clear their lungs effectively. Blood clots are common because immobilised patients cannot move their limbs. Heart failure can occur due to the stress of injury and prolonged bed rest. But the speed and severity of Patton's decline struck some medical experts as unusual. One pulmonologist who reviewed the case in the 1980s noted that Patton went from stable and communicative to critical and dying in less than a week. While complications can arise quickly, the progression described in the available documentation seemed unusually rapid for a patient receiving intensive care in a modern facility. Another physician, a toxicologist, reviewed the symptoms described in newspaper reports from December 1945. Sudden pulmonary edema, cardiac arrhythmia, rapid deterioration. He noted these symptoms could result from injury complications, but they could also result from certain poisonous substances. Specifically, he mentioned digitalis toxicity, which causes cardiac complications and pulmonary edema, and would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening. Without an autopsy, without tissue samples, without toxicology analysis, there's no way to confirm or deny such theories. But the possibility exists, and that possibility, combined with all the other irregularities, fuels the conspiracy theory that Patton didn't die from his injuries. He was killed. Chapter 5. The OSS operative's confession. For more than 30 years, the official narrative of Patton's death remained unchallenged. Tragic accident, medical complications, natural death given his injuries. Historians wrote biographies portraying Patton as a brilliant but troubled commander whose life ended in unfortunate circumstances. Filmmakers made movies celebrating his military genius while depicting his death as a sad footnote to a legendary career. His death was accepted as tragic but unremarkable. And then, in 1979, everything changed. An 84-year-old man named Douglas DeWitt Bazata walked into the office of a military historian working on a book about the Office of Strategic Services. Bazata said he had information about General Patton's death, information that had been classified for more than 3 decades, information that, if true, would rewrite history. Douglas Bazata was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a fringe figure seeking attention. He was a legitimate war hero with verifiable credentials and a documented history of service in America's wartime intelligence apparatus. Born in 1911, Bazata grew up in Pennsylvania and joined the Marine Corps in the early 1930s. He served in various capacities until the outbreak of World War II, when he was recruited by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency. The OSS conducted some of the most sensitive operations of the war: espionage, sabotage, assassination, support for resistance movements, operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly and whose details remain classified even today. Bazata operated behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. He conducted sabotage operations against Nazi infrastructure. He organised partisan resistance networks. He gathered intelligence that helped Allied forces plan operations. His service record is documented in declassified OSS files. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and various foreign awards from governments he aided during the war. He was not a man prone to fantasy or fabrication, and he said he had killed George Patton, not personally, not directly, but as part of an operation ordered by senior American intelligence officials. According to Bazata, in late November 1945, he was approached by a high-ranking OSS officer. Bazata declined to name this officer publicly, saying only that he held a senior position in intelligence operations and had authority to order field operations without political oversight. The officer told Bazata that General Patton had become a problem. Patton's public criticisms of Soviet policy were undermining Allied unity at a crucial moment. The Cold War was beginning. The Yalta Conference had established a delicate balance between the United States and Soviet Union. American intelligence agencies were working to establish networks in Eastern Europe, networks that required Soviet cooperation, or at least Soviet tolerance. Patton's rhetoric threatened all of it. His threats to return to the United States and speak publicly about Soviet aggression could turn American public opinion against cooperation with Stalin. His celebrity status among soldiers and veterans gave him a platform that could shape national policy. The officer told Bazata that political leadership had decided Patton needed to be silenced, permanently. Bazata claimed he refused at first. He argued that Patton was right about the Soviets, that someone needed to speak the truth about Soviet intentions. The officer told him this wasn't about truth. It was about stability. It was about maintaining diplomatic relationships long enough to establish American interests in post-war Europe. It was about preventing a premature confrontation with the Soviet Union that America wasn't ready to fight. The officer told him it was a matter of national security, and national security justified any action. Bazata claimed he was not directly involved in arranging the car accident. He said that aspect of the operation was handled by others, specialists in staged accidents and traffic collisions, but he confirmed the accident was not accidental. The truck driver, he said, was an operative, possibly OSS, possibly another agency. The collision was planned and executed as a way to remove Patton without raising suspicions of foul play. But the accident wasn't supposed to kill Patton. It was supposed to injure him seriously enough to prevent him from returning to the United States and speaking publicly. A career-ending injury that would sideline him while appearing accidental. The neck fracture was a bonus, ensuring Patton would never command again. But then Patton started to recover. Within days of the accident, doctors were talking about possible rehabilitation, about eventual transfer to the United States, about Patton potentially regaining some function. That wasn't acceptable. According to Bazata, the decision was made to finish the operation in the hospital. He claimed he was part of a team that had access to Heidelberg Hospital. They posed as medical staff or military visitors, they gained access to Patton's room, and they administered a substance that would trigger the complications that killed him. Bazata wouldn't specify what substance was used. He suggested something that would cause cardiac and pulmonary complications consistent with his injuries, something that would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening, something that would appear as natural progression of his condition. He said Patton died believing he was succumbing to his injuries, never knowing he was being murdered. Bazata claimed the operation was compartmentalized. Only a handful of people knew the full scope. The operatives involved were told only what they needed to know. Records were destroyed or classified. Witnesses were silenced through transfers, retirement, or more permanent means. He said Soviet intelligence was aware of the operation. They tacitly approved because Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric was creating problems for Stalin as well. But the Soviets were not directly involved. This was an American operation for American reasons. He said the decision came from senior levels of American intelligence, possibly with approval from political leadership, though he had no direct evidence of White House involvement. He said he had stayed silent for more than 30 years out of loyalty to his country and fear of retaliation against himself and his family. But now, in his 80s, with most of the principals dead, he wanted the truth known. He wanted history to record what actually happened. Bazata's confession was explosive. The researcher who first interviewed him was skeptical, but as Bazata provided details, as he named other operations he had participated in, as he described OSS procedures and protocols that matched declassified documents, the researcher began to believe Bazata was telling the truth, at least telling what he believed to be the truth. The researcher published a book in 1981 that included Bazata's claims. The book created immediate controversy. Historians dismissed Bazata as a fabricator. The CIA, successor to the OSS, denied any knowledge of operations targeting Patton. The army reaffirmed that Patton died of natural complications from his accident. But Bazata didn't recant. In 1984, he attended an OSS Veterans Reunion dinner in Washington, D.C. During the event, he stood and publicly repeated his claims about Patton's death. He told a room full of former intelligence operatives that he had been part of the operation. The room fell silent. No one challenged him. No one confirmed him. But no one laughed either. The silence was telling. Several attendees later told journalists they believed Bazata might be telling the truth. Others said the story was plausible, given what they knew about OSS operations during the period. Still others said Bazata was either lying or confused, mixing real operations with imagined ones. Douglas Bazata died in 1999 at age 88, maintaining his story until the end. To this day, no evidence has emerged to definitively prove or disprove his claims. but the fact that a legitimate OSS operative with a documented service record made such specific allegations has kept the conspiracy theory alive. Chapter 6. The Missing Evidence and the Cold War Context. If there was a conspiracy to assassinate General Patton, the evidence should exist somewhere. Intelligence agencies, even when conducting illegal operations, maintain records, operational plans, mission reports, personnel assignments, financial records, after-action reviews. These documents might be classified, compartmentalized, hidden in archives so secure that most government officials don't know they exist. But they exist. So researchers have been searching for decades. What they've found is a pattern of systematic absence. Every document that might confirm or disprove the assassination theory is either missing, destroyed, or classified beyond reach. Patton's medical records, missing. The accident investigation report, classified, then lost. OSS operational files from December 1945, heavily redacted. Personnel records for the truck driver, non-existent. Communications between the War Department and Patton's command, incomplete. Hospital visitor logs from Heidelberg, destroyed. Even routine documents that should exist, that have no national security implications, that would normally be preserved in military archives, are gone. This creates an evidentiary void. Conspiracy theorists point to the missing documents as proof of a cover-up. If there was nothing to hide, they argue, why are so many records missing? Skeptics argue that missing records prove nothing. Documents from 1945 are often incomplete. Archives have limited space. Files are destroyed per retention schedules. Sometimes things just get lost. Both arguments have merit, but the context matters. The Cold War was beginning in December 1945. The Office of Strategic Services was transitioning to the Central Intelligence Agency. American intelligence operations were becoming more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, more willing to conduct operations that violated both law and ethics in service of national security. We know this now because documents from that era have been declassified, slowly, over decades. We know about Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists to America despite their war crimes. We know about MK-Ultra, which conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. We know about COINTELPRO, which surveilled and disrupted domestic political groups. We know about assassination programs targeting foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. We know American intelligence agencies were capable of murder, deception, and massive cover-ups. So when someone suggests they might have killed an inconvenient general in 1945, it's not a crazy theory. It's consistent with what we know those agencies did. The question isn't whether American intelligence agencies were capable of such an operation. The question is whether they actually conducted one. And without the evidence, we cannot know for certain. Epilogue. What if Patton had lived? The final question haunts every discussion of Patton's death. What if he had survived? What if the accident had been less severe? What if he had recovered? What if he had returned to the United States? Would George Patton have become a political figure? Would he have run for office, bringing his celebrity status and military reputation into the political arena? Would he have testified before Congress about Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements, about forced population transfers, about political purges in Eastern Europe? Would he have written a book exposing what he viewed as Allied betrayals of the peoples we claim to liberate? Would he have shaped public opinion about the emerging Cold War? We'll never know. But the fact that we ask these questions reveals something important. Patton mattered. His voice mattered. His perspective, right or wrong, represented a viewpoint that vanished from American discourse after December 1945. Some historians argue that Patton's death was fortunate for America. His aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union could have triggered a premature confrontation that would have been catastrophic. The Cold War required careful management, patient containment, strategic diplomacy. Patton would have undermined all of that. Other historians argue that Patton was right, that confronting Soviet expansion immediately, while American forces were still mobilized in Europe, would have prevented decades of Cold War conflict, that his warnings about Stalin were prescient and should have been heeded. Both arguments assume Patton would have had significant influence if he had lived, and maybe that's why he died. The last line Patton wrote in his diary, just days before the accident, reads, "History will prove me right. They just don't want to hear it yet." He never got the chance to make his case. 79 years later, the debate continues. Was his death a tragic accident? A politically convenient outcome that some officials were relieved to see? Or a calculated assassination ordered by intelligence agencies that viewed him as a threat to national security? The files remain classified. The witnesses remain silent. The medical records remain missing. And George Smith Patton Jr. remains buried in Luxembourg, alongside the soldiers he commanded, his warnings unheeded, his voice silenced, his truth lost to history. Unless Douglas Bazata was telling the truth, unless somewhere, in some classified archive, the evidence exists, unless someday someone finds the files that prove what really happened on that December morning in 1945. Until then, we're left with questions, and sometimes the questions we cannot answer reveal more than the questions we can.